The sound reached her before anything else did. It was low and broken, not quite a cry, and not quite a whimper, but somewhere between the two. And it drifted up from the bottom of the ravine in the last fading light of late afternoon. Mara Cole stopped walking. She stood on the narrow trail, with the backpack pressing into both shoulders, and the cold coming hard off the ridge above her, and she did not move. She just listened. The sound came again. 4 years in the field had changed certain things about the way she moved through wild places. She could no longer walk into a forest without reading it, without tracking every shift in sound and light and air, the way other people tracked the time on a clock. She knew the difference between a bird alarmed by weather and a bird alarmed by a predator. She knew the difference between a branch breaking under wind and a branch breaking under weight. She knew the difference between an animal that was lost and an animal that was caught, and the sound coming up from the ravine below the trail was not the sound of something lost. She turned off her trail light. The dark settled around her immediately, closing in from every direction. The trees became shapes, and then shadows, and then just an impression of mass in the dark, and the trail itself reduced to a pale strip between two walls of nothing. She let her eyes adjust. Down in the ravine below the trail, 30 feet or more of steep earth and root and cold stone, the last gray-blue edge of the day was still visible, as a thin reflection off the frozen mud at the bottom. The sound rose from somewhere close to that thin strip of light. She stepped off the trail and started down the slope. It was steep and wet, layered with old pine needles and leaves that had gone soft in the cold, and she came down it sideways, with one hand pressed flat to the earth beside her. Her boots found grip on the exposed roots and held. She had bought them 3 seasons ago from a shop in Inverness, because the man behind the counter had told her they were designed for exactly this kind of ground, and she had not found reason to disagree with him once in the 3 winters since. She moved without noise beyond the quiet compression of wet earth under her weight and followed the sound. It cycled, steady as a clock, 3 seconds of that low broken sound, 4 seconds of silence. 3 on, 4 off. The animal making it was not thrashing. It had passed through the thrashing stage long ago. It had passed through everything that came before this too. The fighting and the struggling and the desperate work of trying to pull free. What she was hearing now was on the other side of all of that. It was just presence. It was just the animal saying, "I am still here. I am still here. I am still here." She came around a cluster of exposed roots at the base of the ravine wall and saw the cub. He was small, much smaller than she had expected. She put his age at 8 weeks, perhaps 10. His fur was pale gray, the particular pale gray of wood ash in the moment before it goes fully cold and turns white, and it still had the fine, soft texture of a coat that had not yet grown into itself. He lay on his side on the frozen mud, with his right front leg stretched at an angle that was clearly wrong, and the snare wire circled that leg just above the paw. The wire was tight against the skin and anchored to a thick root that ran along the floor of the ravine. The wire itself was deep brown with rust. This snare had not been checked in a very long time. The cub heard her land at the base of the slope and went completely still. The sound stopped. She stopped too. She crouched down on the frozen mud and placed both hands flat on the earth in front of her, palms facing down, and held that position. She was about 10 feet from him. She did not move forward. She had learned from the first wolf she had ever spent real time with in the field, a lone female on the edge of a pine forest in Finland, that the most important thing you can give a frightened animal is not silence and not distance, but time. The silence and the distance are just the container. The thing you are actually offering is time. You hold still and let the clock move, and eventually the animal tells you what kind of large thing you are, and then you can begin. She waited. The cold was intensifying. She could feel it in her knuckles and along the side of her jaw, and in the particular compression in her chest that told her the temperature had dropped by at least 2 degrees since she stepped off the trail. Ravines were cold sinks. Everything that cooled in the forest above ran down the slopes and collected at the bottom and stayed. She thought about the cub lying on frozen mud with wire cutting into his leg and his core temperature dropping, and she kept herself still anyway, because hurrying now would cost her more than waiting. 2 minutes. She counted them. The cub lifted his head. His eyes were pale gold, not the full amber they would eventually become, but the early version of that color, the color of a candle flame seen through glass. He looked at her with a focus that was not quite fear and not quite assessment, but the thing that comes before you can decide between the two. She met his eyes for 2 seconds, and then looked away to her left, to the ground beside him, the way you look when you are not presenting yourself as a problem. She reached into the front pocket of her pack slowly. The zip made its small metallic sound. His left ear rotated toward it. She waited for the ear to settle before she reached in and found the wire cutters by touch. She always carried wire cutters in the field. She had used them once before, in a different forest in a different country, on a snare that had been empty by the time she found it. She had filed a report on that one, and the rangers had removed 40 more from a 3-kilometer stretch of trail. She had never found tracks around that first snare. She had thought about it more than she cared to admit. She held the wire cutters still at her side and began moving forward. One knee at a time, weight low, gazed to the side of the cub. When she was close enough, she reached out and worked 2 fingers under the wire, between the metal and the skin, lifting it slightly away from the leg. The cub's leg twitched. She held her position and waited. He made a sound that was not the cycling sound she had been hearing from the slope above. This was something quieter and more internal, something that had nothing to do with calling out, and everything to do with a body registering pain. Then he went still. She placed the wire cutters at the highest point of tension, where the wire bent most sharply into the skin, and she cut. The wire separated and fell loose onto the frozen mud. The cub lay still for 3 full seconds. Then he pulled his leg back slowly toward his body, the way you move a limb you are not sure you can trust anymore. The paw touched the ground. His whole body flinched, a deep, fast, full-body response that ran from his nose to the base of his tail, and was gone, almost before it finished. He did not cry out. She watched the leg move. The bone was intact. She could tell by the quality of the movement. A fractured bone would have altered the relationship of the joint, with the weight above it, and the leg would have moved wrong in a very specific way. This leg moved correctly, painfully and slowly but correctly, and that meant the damage was in the tissue and the skin, and not in the structure. She sat back on her heels and waited. The cub pushed himself upright on 3 legs. It took him 2 attempts, and the shaking in his limbs was visible even at this distance. But he stood. He hung his head for a moment, just breathing, and then he took 1 step toward her. She stayed completely still. Another step. He stopped with his nose about 12 inches from her knee, and she felt the faint warmth of his breath through the fabric of her trousers. He sniffed her knee, her hand, the wire cutters she was still holding loosely. Then he sat down on the frozen mud beside her and made a sound that was short and quiet and low and went straight into her chest in a way that 4 years of field training had not prepared her for. She set the wire cutters down and reached for the flask of broth in the side pocket of her pack. She had carried this flask every field day for 3 years, because she had learned in her second winter that there were nights when nothing hot was available for miles in any direction, and having something warm on her person was the difference between a functioning night and a compromised one. The broth was barely warm. She poured a small amount into the cap and set it on the frozen mud in front of him. He sniffed the cap, then drank. She opened her notebook while he drank and wrote the date and the time and the location by grid reference. She noted the species, the approximate age, the injury, and what she had done about it. She described the snare and its condition, the placement against the root base, the degree of rust on the trigger wire. She wrote it the way she always wrote field notes, in clear factual sentences, with no emotion in them. Then at the bottom she wrote, "Name provisional, Coda." She looked at that for a moment. She had never named a field animal. It was not protocol, and it was not professional, and she knew it. She left it anyway. He had finished the broth. He was sitting beside her on the frozen mud, with his injured paw held slightly off the ground, and his pale gold eyes on her face. The shaking in his limbs had reduced to a fine, barely visible tremor, and she thought most of what remained was cold rather than fear. She pulled the spare thermal layer from the bottom of her pack and wrapped him in it. He pressed into the warmth immediately, completely, with no hesitation, the way cold things move toward heat when heat becomes available. She made a pouch from the thermal layer and held him against her chest and secured the whole arrangement with the strap of her field bag. His heartbeat came through the fabric against her sternum. It was fast and light and absolutely steady. She climbed back up the ravine wall with one hand on the earth and the other arm holding him close. Camp was 40 minutes north at a steady walking pace. She had been here for 11 days, with 4 days remaining in her approved field window. The camp was a single research tent, in a stand of old pines set back from a dry creek bed. She had her stove and her water filter, and enough field rations for another 6 days. She had her data, 11 days of it. More movement data on this wolf pack than any previous researcher had collected in 3 years of prior attempts in this range. 11 confirmed pack members. The alpha she had mapped across 6 different territory positions. He was large, larger than any wolf she had documented here, with a coat that ran from dark charcoal at the spine to pale silver at the sides, and a scar on the left side of his face that she could identify through her long lens at 400 meters without needing a second look. She walked north with Coda against her chest, and the trail light making its narrow path through the dark ahead of her. At the 17-minute mark, she turned the light off. She had not decided to do it. Her hand simply moved. She stood in the dark on the trail and listened to the forest around her, not to any particular sound, but to the sum of all of them, the insects and the small branch shifts and the 10,000 minor movements of living things that fill a forest at night. She had learned to listen to this baseline the way a sound engineer listens to silence between recorded tracks. The baseline was constant, always the same, until something entered the space and disrupted it. When that happened, the small things stopped because they were unsure of what the disruption was. They stopped and they waited, and the silence they left behind was more telling than any sound they could have made. The baseline had dropped. She stood on the trail and counted to 60, a full 60 seconds, and the silence held all the way through. She turned the light back on and walked faster. Not running. She would not run in this dark with an injured cub against her chest and this kind of ground underfoot. But she walked with full intention, and her eyes moved the way she had trained them to move at night, slightly off-center, using the more light-sensitive cells at the outer edge of her vision that the darkness could not strip away the way it stripped away everything else. The trees on both sides showed her nothing. No movement, no shape out of place, just pine and shadow and the sound of the wind moving through them both. She reached camp at 8:47 by her watch. She unzipped the tent entrance, set her pack inside, and lowered herself and Coda through the opening. She zipped it closed behind her. She turned on the battery lamp. Yellow light filled the interior, small and warm, and she sat down with her back against the main tent pole and unwrapped the thermal layer slowly. Coda looked up at her. He blinked once against the light. Then he lowered his head onto her leg, with his injured paw held just slightly off the surface of her sleeping bag, and his eyes went to half-mast and stayed there. She sat without moving and looked at the tent wall. The feeling that had started on the trail at the 17-minute mark had not gone. She had spent enough time in enough wild places to know the difference between feelings that were noise and feelings that were signal. The noise feelings were loud and arrived with their reasons attached. The signal feelings were quiet and patient, and they just pointed, without explanation, at something in the dark that you had not yet given a name to. This one was pointing at the forest outside the tent. She held her notebook in her lap and listened, and the dark outside held its silence very carefully, the way things hold silence when they are not actually empty. She did not sleep. The battery lamp stayed on at its lowest setting, a dim amber that was more warmth than light, just enough to make out the outline of Coda on the sleeping bag and the walls of the tent around him. He slept deeply. In the first hour, she had found a clean field dressing in her medical kit and patted the area around his injured leg, where the wire had broken the skin. He had not protested the attention. He had looked at her hands while she worked with those pale gold eyes, and then closed them and gone back under, and now his breathing was the slow, even breathing of a young animal in genuine rest. The kind of rest that follows exhausted effort the way sleep follows hard physical work, and looks like the same thing but is not. She sat with her back against the tent pole and listened. The wind moved through the pines above the tent in the low, steady way it always moved at this elevation after dark. She had heard it every night for 11 nights running. She knew the particular tone it made through these specific trees, the way the sound shaped itself around the trunks and the upper branches and the spaces between them. It was a sound she had learned without trying to learn it, the way you learn the sounds of a place you spend enough time in, until the place speaks a language you can hear underneath your conscious attention. She knew what this sound was supposed to be. She was listening for it to become something else. At 9:20, she heard a sound she could not identify. It lasted less than 2 seconds, and it came from the eastern side of the camp. She went very still, and tried to find a category for it. Not a branch, not a bird, not the particular soft collapse of a snowfield releasing weight, not wind in any configuration she recognized. The quality of it was muffled, as though it had passed through something between its source and her, and it had a weight to it that was inconsistent with anything smaller than a large mammal. She sat in the tent and waited for it to come again. It did not come again. She sat with the silence for 20 minutes, long enough to be sure the sound was not part of a pattern. Then she told herself she needed water. Her camp stove was just outside, positioned on the flat stone she had found on her second day and used as a cooking surface ever since. A pot of melted snow water sat in the stove's base compartment. She needed it for a hot drink and for the morning. She told herself this clearly and specifically, because she wanted to know exactly what she was going outside for before she went. She clipped her headlamp to her forehead, set it on its medium beam, and unzipped the tent. The cold hit her face immediately, clean and complete. The cold of a mountain night with no insulation between you and the sky. She stepped out and straightened up and swept the headlamp in a slow arc across the camp. The beam moved across the cooking stone, across the food bag hanging in the pine, across the guy lines, across the ground between the tent and the tree line. It hit the mud beside the left tent peg, and she stopped moving. The print was unmistakable. She could see the tread in the mud, with perfect clarity under the direct beam. Heel, ball, the pressed pattern of a walking boot's sole, size 10 or 11. The edges of the print were still sharp, not blurred, not filled in, not softened by the settling that mud does as it freezes more deeply. Sharp edges meant recent. She thought 2 hours at the outside, probably less. She crouched down and looked at it without touching the ground. She had spent enough time on her knees in wet ground to know exactly what a fresh print looked like versus an older one, and this one was fresh. She moved the lamp to the right and found the second print, 18 inches from the first. Same boot, same person. The stride consistent with walking pace rather than anything hurried. She followed the beam and the prints in a line along the north side of the tent. Then she moved the lamp to the left of the entrance and began to work the other side. The second set was on the east side of the tent, coming in from the tree line. She could see where they entered the camp, a clean set of entering prints that disturbed the frost layer on the outer edge of the camp, and then became more distinct as they moved onto the muddier ground nearer the tent. Different tread, shorter stride, someone slightly shorter or slightly lighter, or both. She straightened up and worked the lamp slowly in a wider arc, covering the full perimeter of the camp. The third set came from the south. She found them beside the cooking stone, which they had passed close to without disturbing. A narrower sole, a shallower tread impression, which told her lighter weight. This third person had come in from the southern approach and moved northwest, between the cooking stone and the back of the tent, and then turned east. She tracked all three sets with the lamp, moving back and forth across the camp, building the picture of what had happened here while she was in the ravine. 3 people, 3 directions of approach. That was not a coincidence, and it was not a group of hikers who had wandered off a trail. That was coordination. 3 people who had known where they were going and had come from separate directions deliberately, which meant they had been in communication before they arrived, which meant they had been watching the camp, or the approaches to it before she returned. She followed the prints to where they converged, on the north side of the camp near the tree line. All 3 sets met there, and then went into the dark between the pines, and the ground hardened past the frost layer, and the prints faded, but she could still see the direction they went, which was east, back toward the trail. She followed them 6 feet into the tree line with the headlamp until the ground hardened to the point that the prints were too faint to follow in this direction. She moved the lamp east along the edge of the trees and found the prints again, 10 feet further on. They were moving east. Then they turned south. Back toward the camp. She stood at the tree line with the headlamp and looked into the dark between the pines, and her heart was doing something specific in her chest that she recognized because she had felt it before in the field, in situations that required her to be very careful about what she did next. It was not panic. She had a physiological relationship with panic that was more familiar than most people's, and she knew the difference between panic and a sustained, elevated level of alertness that was appropriate to the information she had just gathered. She turned off the headlamp. She stood in the dark at the edge of the tree line and listened. The wind was still in the pines. Under it, she tried to find anything else. A breath at the wrong distance. A shift of weight on frozen ground. The particular stillness of a person who has decided to stand very still because they know someone is listening. She was listening for that specific kind of stillness, which is paradoxically audible if you know how to hear it. She stood without moving for 4 full minutes. Then she turned the headlamp back on, went to the cooking stone, picked up the pot of water, and went back into the tent. She zipped the tent closed, sat down with the pot in her lap, and looked at Kota. He had not woken. He was still on his side on the sleeping bag, with the padded field dressing on his leg, and his breathing slow and even. She watched him for a moment. Then she picked up her notebook and wrote down what she had found, in the exact order she had found it, with the specific details that would matter. Tread patterns, approximate sizes, the direction of approach, the convergence point, the evidence of the prints turning south back toward the camp. Then she wrote, 3 people came to this camp tonight while I was in the ravine. They came from 3 separate directions. They circled the tent. They converged on the north side. The prints continue east and then turn south. I do not know whether they left or whether they turned south back toward the camp and are still in the tree line. She underlined that last sentence twice. She thought about the satellite communicator. She had the schedule memorized because she had used it twice in 4 years, and both times the schedule had been the crucial variable. The next overhead window was 2 hours and 53 minutes away. She set the notebook down and looked at the battery lamp. She turned it off. Total darkness. She sat in the dark with the pot of water cooling in her lap, and let the blackout work. Let her eyes give up on light and her ears take over completely. The tent fabric was thin enough that she could hear individual pine branches if she knew how to listen. She knew how to listen. She directed everything she had toward the walls of the tent and the world outside them. At 10:53, the sound from the eastern side returned. Same quality as before. 2 seconds, then silence. She placed it at a different position than the first time, which meant either the same person had moved, or there had been more than one person on the east side all along. At 11:18, she heard the specific small crack of weight, redistributing on frozen ground, close. Not from the tree line. From the north side of the tent, 6 to 8 feet from the fabric. At 11:24, a heavier sound from the east, 12 feet. At 11:31, the lightest of the 3, briefly, from the south. 3 positions, north, east, south. She sat in the dark tent and confirmed what she had suspected since she came back in from the tree line. They had not left. They had turned south and come back, and they were standing in the dark around her tent, and they had been there, quiet and patient and very still, while she was reading their boot prints in the mud with her headlamp. She reached for her notebook in the dark and ran her thumb across a clean page and thought about what she would write in it when she had light again, because she was going to have light again, and she was going to write everything, and that was the clearest and most useful thing she could do right now. Kota shifted on the sleeping bag beside her, just slightly, a small adjustment of position. His breathing continued, slow and even. She sat in the dark and listened to the 3 positions outside the tent, which were also listening, and neither side moved, and the cold deepened around the tent, and the night went on. She sat in the dark for a long time after she had turned off the lamp, longer than she needed to in order to confirm the positions. She sat because moving, any movement that made a sound through the tent walls, would tell the men outside something she did not want to tell them. She wanted them to believe they could not be heard from inside the tent. She wanted to preserve whatever advantage that belief gave her. Her mind ran through the terrain she knew between her camp and the nearest point of contact. The ranger station was 4.5 kilometers by trail. The trail to it was the same trail she used to enter and leave the study area, the same trail that Graham Bale and Roy Sims and Carl Eaton had used to approach her camp. They had come in on the trail, and they would leave on the trail, or they would leave through the forest, and either way the trail was not a route she wanted to use in the dark with 3 people between her and where she needed to go. She thought about the terrain off-trail. She knew it well enough for daylight movement, and reasonably well for dusk. She did not know it for deep night movement with an injured cub and an unreliable headlamp battery. She moved that option to the back of the list. She thought about the satellite window. 2 hours and 29 minutes was the number she had held. She corrected it. Given how long she had been sitting here, it was closer to 2 hours and 15 minutes now. 2 hours and 15 minutes was a specific number that had a specific endpoint, and the endpoint was useful, and reaching it required only one thing, which was for her to remain in the tent and be present at the communicator when the window opened. She could do that. She had done harder things in 4 years of field work. She had spent 48 hours in a hide in the rain, waiting for an animal that did not come. She had navigated out of a river crossing in the dark, after the light failed and the water rose. She had sat with a broken stove in sub-zero temperatures in northern Sweden, and made the night manageable by thinking about it in small segments, 1 hour at a time, until the segments added up to morning. She thought about the night in small segments. The first segment was the satellite window. That was all she had to do in that segment. Stay in the tent, stay aware, be ready at the communicator. When the window opened, she would have a message out in 3 minutes, and the situation would have changed. That was segment 1. Segment 2 began after the transmission, and went until Owen Hart or someone responded. She did not know how long that segment would be. It depended on who responded, how fast, and from where. She set it aside, and focused on segment 1. She reached for her notebook in the dark, found it by touch, and held it in her lap. She would not write in the dark. She would think in the dark and write when she had light, and she was going to have light soon, and what she would write when she did would be useful to the people who needed to respond to the message she was going to transmit in 2 hours and 12 minutes. Coda breathed beside her, slow and even. She sat in the dark, and breathed too, and listened to the 3 positions outside the tent hold their silence in the forest that held everything else, and she thought through the next 2 hours, in the careful, practical way she had learned to think about hard stretches of time. At 11:44, she heard the voice. It was brief, 4 or 5 words at most, spoken somewhere on the north side of the tent, and the words themselves were taken by the wind before they reached her in any complete form. What reached her was the tone. She had been listening for several hours with a focus that had stripped everything else away, and the tone was the thing she catalogued first, before she tried to reconstruct the words, because tone carried more information. It was not hushed. People lower their voices when they believe they might be overheard, and are trying to prevent it, and this voice was not lowered. It was simply at the volume a man uses when he is speaking to someone nearby, who he trusts to listen and does not need to shout at. The tone was flat and unhurried, patient, in the specific way that patience sounds when it comes not from waiting, but from certainty. The certainty that the situation is under control, and time is on your side. She sat with her back against the tent pole, and let that settle. She had dealt with many kinds of difficulty in 4 years of field work. Weather, injury, equipment failure, the particular isolation of weeks in unpopulated terrain, with no human contact, and nothing to hold the day together, except the work itself. She had developed a working relationship with difficulty that was practical rather than emotional, a habit of measuring what she had and what she needed and the distance between them. But that habit had always been applied to things that were impersonal. Bad weather had no intent. Equipment did not choose to fail. What was outside this tent had intent, and intent changed the calculation in a way she was working through carefully. She made a decision about the lamp. Keeping it off kept her from writing, and writing was the most useful thing she could do in the time she had before the satellite window. Turning it on communicated that she was awake, but they almost certainly knew she was awake. She had gone outside to check the camp. They would have heard that. And keeping the light off was not providing her with any tactical advantage she could identify, because she already knew where they were, and they already knew where she was. She turned the lamp on. The inside of the tent appeared in amber. Coda did not react. She opened her notebook to a clean page and began. She wrote the date and the time, and her full name, and her institutional affiliation, and her field site designation, and her GPS coordinates from her last waypoint, which was 36 hours old, but accurate to within 200 meters. Then she wrote the account from the beginning, starting with the moment she had first heard the sound from the ravine. She wrote it in the order it had happened, and she wrote it with the same discipline she used for all her field documentation: specific, factual, detailed. Times, positions, measurements, observations. She described the 3 sets of boot prints and the evidence of their approach directions. She described the convergence point and the evidence of return. She described the 3 positions she had identified by sound during the last 2 hours. She wrote the time at which she had heard the voice and described its quality and position. She described what she concluded from the evidence: 3 people with coordinated positions who had come to this camp intentionally and were maintaining their positions around it. She wrote the satellite communicator status, Window in 2 hours and 22 minutes. Then she turned to a fresh page. She wrote, "This is a personal statement. I am writing it for whoever finds this notebook." She wrote her name again, and the date, and the fact that she was a wildlife researcher, with full institutional authorization to be in this location. She described the nature of her work, and the duration of her stay. She described finding the wolf cub in the snare, and bringing him to the camp, and the reasons for that decision. She wrote that she had no connection to any illegal activity, and that everything she had done in 11 days in this location was documented in the preceding pages of this notebook, and in the data files on her field equipment, and in the 11 days of correspondence with her university. She wrote, "I do not know who is outside this tent. I know there are 3 of them, and I know they have been here for several hours. I attempted to reach emergency services via satellite communicator, and the window was not available. The next window is in approximately 2 hours and 19 minutes. She wrote Claire's name, Claire Anson, 14 Drummond Place, Edinburgh. She wrote both phone numbers. She wrote the name of her department head and the main university switchboard number. She paused, then she wrote one more sentence. "Please make sure the wolf cub is safe." She looked at the sentence for a moment. Then she turned back to the field note pages and continued documenting. She thought about Owen Hart. She had spoken to him twice by radio in 11 days, both times in the morning hours. He was the only ranger covering this section of the forest, following a staffing reduction at the station that had left him as the sole person for a range he was frank about being too large for one person to cover effectively. She had liked Owen Hart because he was direct about what he could and could not do, and in her experience, directness in rangers was rarer than it should have been. She had his secondary channel frequency memorized. She had the field radio charged and at hand. She also had no way of knowing whether Owen Hart was awake at this hour, or monitoring the secondary channel, or anywhere near enough to her position to arrive in a useful time frame. 4.5 kilometers on foot in this terrain, and this dark, was not a short walk. She thought about the audio recorder, still aimed at the east wall vent, still running. She checked the battery by pressing the status button, 61% remaining, enough for several more hours. She verified the record indicator was covered, and left it running. She thought about what she had in the tent that was genuinely useful. The satellite communicator in 2 hours and 16 minutes. That was first. The field radio with its uncertain reception at this hour and this distance. That was second. The notebook, which was already serving its function. Third. The audio recorder, running. Fourth. The field knife in the side pocket of her pack. She looked at the pack. She looked at the side pocket. She did not reach for it. She closed the notebook. She thought about the Alpha. She had been trying not to think about the Alpha in a way that became hope rather than analysis, because hope in a difficult situation was not the same as useful thinking, and she was committed to useful thinking. But the analysis kept arriving at the same place, and the place was this. The Alpha had used this territory with a consistency and a regularity that placed him in or adjacent to this immediate location on 5 of the last 11 days. Not near it. Here. This stand of pines, this creek bed, this clearing. The camera trap on the trail north of camp had recorded him moving north-northeast at 5:20 this morning, less than 20 hours ago. A wolf covering this territory at night could cover several kilometers in a few hours. He could be anywhere in the territory right now. He could be on the far edge of the northern boundary, 15 kilometers from here. He could be at the river crossing to the west. He could be on the ridge above the camp. She did not build a theory on that. She noted it, and held it, and kept it in the back of her thinking, while she continued to focus on the things that were within her actual control. At 12:13, she heard the north position shift, a full weight redistribution, the sound of a person who has been standing in one position for a long time, and whose body has requested a change. The frozen crust made its small sound, and then went silent. At 12:14, the east position made a sound she thought was a voice, too quiet to carry content. At 12:15, the south moved. She noted the times in the notebook. At 12:17, Coda woke up. He came awake all at once. Not gradually, not in the layers of surface consciousness that normal waking moves through. His head came up off the sleeping bag in one clean, complete movement, and his eyes opened fully, and he sat up on 3 legs with his injured paw held slightly off the surface, and he turned his head toward the north wall of the tent. He sat there and looked at the north wall with his pale gold eyes, and his ears fully forward, and his chest beginning to rise with a slow, deliberate, very deep breath. The kind of breath she had only seen in an animal that was engaged in something well below the threshold of ordinary perception. She set her pen down very carefully on the sleeping bag. Outside, in the dark on the north side of the tent, she heard something shift its weight. Koda's chest kept expanding. The breath was slow, and it was deep, and it was not finished. His nose turned slightly, north-northeast, following something she could not hear. His eyes did not blink. She put her hands flat on her thighs, and sat very still, and watched him breathe. The amber light of the lamp was in his eyes, and the tent walls were around him, and she was beside him, and none of it was what his attention was on. His attention was on something outside the tent that had no physical reference she could point to, something that was not sound at the normal range of hearing, and not scent at this distance, through a sealed tent wall, something that moved between the cub and the forest outside, through a channel she did not have a name for, and did not need a name for right now. His chest was fully expanded. Everything was gathered. She held her breath. She looked at what she had written in the notebook, and she thought about who was going to read it. Field notes were read by other researchers, by supervisors, by committees evaluating the quality of data. Personal statements were read by investigators, by lawyers, by courts. She had never written a personal statement in a field notebook before, and she was aware as she wrote it that it needed to serve multiple possible readers simultaneously, and the readers might not know anything about the context she was writing from. She wrote a sentence explaining the context. This is written in a research tent in a study area in which the author has been working for 11 days. The nearest human settlement is the town of Albridge, approximately 30 kilometers east by road. The nearest facility is the Harwick Ranger Station, 4.5 kilometers north on the main trail. She wrote Owen Hart's name and the secondary radio channel number. She wrote a short description of the terrain between the camp and the station, not for her own reference but for anyone who might need to come in. She knew the terrain well. She wrote the landmarks clearly. The flat stone bridge over the creek at the 2-kilometer mark, the point where the trail split, and the left fork went to the ridge, and the right fork continued north to the station. The pine cluster at the 3-kilometer mark that was visible from both directions. She reread what she had written, and then she did something she had not done in any of her field notebooks in 4 years. She drew a rough map in the margin. It was not a good map by any cartographic standard, but it was accurate, and it showed the camp and the trail and the station and the 4.5 kilometers between them. Then she closed the notebook and thought about the Alpha. She could not stop thinking about the Alpha. She had been trying to keep the thinking about the Alpha in the analytical category, the category where data lived, and where conclusions were held to the standard that the evidence warranted. But the data kept producing a conclusion that was in a different category, a category she did not have a formal name for in her fieldwork, the category of things that might happen if the situation continued to develop in the direction it appeared to be developing. She had 11 days of positioning data that placed the Alpha in or adjacent to this immediate area on 5 of those 11 days. She had this morning's camera trap image of him moving north-northeast from this site at 5:20. She had a pack of 11 wolves somewhere in this territory, whose cub was in the tent she was sitting in. She thought about the word adjacent. Adjacent was not the word for what the data showed. The data showed central. This location was central in the Alpha's territory. She had been treating it as a transit point because her research frame made transit points the meaningful category, the places animals pass through, rather than the places they live. But the Alpha's data pattern did not look like transit. It looked like residency, like return, like an animal that came back to a specific location because that location was the heart of the thing he was managing. She thought about what it meant to be at the heart of the thing he was managing. The satellite window was 1 hour and 51 minutes away. Outside, the north position shifted its weight. She heard the boot on the frozen crust, and then the silence after it. She estimated the position was maintaining 6 to 8 feet from the tent wall, unchanged from her earlier estimate. She thought about the 3 men, and what they were waiting for. Patient men waited for conditions to improve, for fatigue to set in, for a mistake that created an opening. She thought about whether any of those conditions were going to arrive before the satellite window opened. She thought, probably not. Fatigue in trained field workers set in on a longer timeline. She had been awake for over 19 hours, and she was functional. She would be functional for several more hours. She was not going to make a mistake significant enough to create an opening. The satellite window was 1 hour and 49 minutes away. Koda's chest was still expanding. She watched him in the amber light of the lamp, and she thought about what she had read in that single-author paper about deep contact calls, and she thought about the distance between the camp and wherever the Alpha was right now, and she thought about the phrase, bonded individuals, and she looked at the pale gold eyes, and the north-pointing nose, and the small gray body, sitting absolutely still on the sleeping bag, and she waited. Graham Bale went down into the ravine at 8 o'clock. He moved carefully because careful movement was what the work required, and he had been doing this work for long enough to know that the shortcuts were precisely where everything went wrong. He came down the slope with one hand on the exposed root shelf, and the other carrying the long directional torch he used for detail examination, and he reached the bottom of the ravine and walked the floor slowly with the beam low, following the curve of the root line along the south wall. He found the trap at 8:14. It was where he had set it 6 weeks ago, pinned against the base of the large root, at the angle where two ravine walls met, positioned at the only viable passage point along this section of the floor. The trap was open. He crouched down and examined it without touching it. The wire had been cut. He could see the cut end clearly in the torch beam, the bright clean face of freshly severed metal where the rust stopped and the raw wire showed through. He took a long look at the cut and then moved the beam to the ground around the trap. Boot prints. Flat-soled, small, size 7, positioned in a way that told him the person had crouched here and worked close to the ground for a period of time before withdrawing. He read the prints the way he had learned to read prints over 22 years, which meant reading them backward as well as forward. This person had approached the trap from the north, crouched here, worked, and then moved to a sitting position for a period of time, before standing and walking north again. The depth of the sitting impression told him they had been in that position for several minutes, not hurried. He moved the beam further out along the ravine floor and found the second set of prints, lighter, smaller contact area, uneven weight distribution, heavier on 3 points rather than 4, which told him the fourth point was an injured limb. He moved the beam along these prints and found them changing gradually, the weight distribution shifting as the animal recovered the use of the injured limb. By the time the prints reached the base of the slope, they were close to normal. He found the flask cap 4 feet from the trap position. He picked it up with one gloved finger and sniffed it. Broth, still faint, made within the last 2 or 3 hours. He straightened up and took one more sweep of the ravine with the torch beam, confirming the picture he had already built, and then he walked back to the slope. Roy Sims was waiting at the base of the wall. Roy was a large man, wide and heavy, with a way of occupying space that was useful in some contexts and a liability in others. Right now he was standing with his hands at his sides looking impatient, which was Roy's default expression when he had been asked to wait and had decided he did not like it. Carl Eaton was further up the slope, crouched on a root platform, watching the top of the ravine wall. Carl was different from Roy in almost every way that mattered to Graham. Carl was younger and lighter and quiet in the way that useful people are quiet. Not because they were not thinking, but because they had decided that thinking was better done in silence. Graham had brought Carl in 3 years ago for exactly that quality, and had not regretted it. Graham reached Roy, and spoke at the volume the work required, which was low and direct. "Someone found the cub before us," he said, cut the wire and took it north. Flat-soled boot, size 7, female most likely. They sat with it for several minutes, and gave it something warm before they left. Deliberate. Someone who knew what they were doing with an injured animal. Roy looked at the cut wire end that Graham was still holding between 2 gloved fingers. He had the expression he always had when plans changed, which was a particular version of his impatient expression that carried an additional quality Graham had learned to manage carefully. Graham dropped the wire. He looked up the slope and raised 2 fingers in a specific direction, and Carl was already moving before the gesture finished. Then Graham turned to the boot prints heading north and began following them to the slope. "North," he said. "Camp at the creek bed if I had to guess. They always set up at the creek bed when they are working in this section." He began to climb. Graham Bale had been in this work for 22 years. He had started young, in his early 20s, working the hill country to the north where the work was simpler and the clients were local and the money was modest. The work had expanded gradually, the way work does when you are good at it and willing to let the scope grow. Better clients, longer chains, more careful logistics. The supply side required patience and skill, and a deep knowledge of terrain, and Graham had all three. The demand side had expanded beyond what he had expected when he was starting out, and the prices that expansion had created were the reason the work had become what it had become, rather than remaining what it was. He did not think of himself as a man without principles. He thought of himself as a man with a very specific and coherent set of principles that most people simply chose not to share, because they had not looked at the world directly enough. He had looked at it directly. He had concluded that things had value based on what people would pay for them, and what people would pay for certain things was determined by how difficult those things were to obtain, and difficulty was something he could engineer. He had been engineering it for 22 years, and the operation was, by any metric he applied to it, a success. The cub had been a specific order, placed 3 weeks ago, with a specific delivery window that was now narrowing in a way that created pressure he did not like. Pressure was the enemy of precision. He had managed it before, and he would manage it now. They reached the trail at the top of the ravine, and Graham found the boot prints immediately, heading north at a walking pace. He had a torch and a clear trail, and a person ahead of him who was moving toward a camp that was almost certainly at the creek bed, because that was where the researchers always positioned when they were working this section. He had seen it twice before. He had taken careful note of it both times, not because it was relevant then, but because information about how this territory was used by other people was always worth holding. He started north. They moved in file, Graham first, Carl behind, Roy at the back. The pace Graham set was working pace, the pace he had developed over years of exactly this kind of movement through forested terrain at night. Faster than people expected, quieter than they thought possible. He had trained himself to move at this pace, the way a person trains for anything, through repetition and discipline, and the willingness to be uncomfortable during the training period. At the 20-minute mark, he saw the light through the pines. He stopped the column with one hand raised behind him, and stood on the trail and studied the light. Yellow, dim, low to the ground. The light of a battery lamp on a low setting, not a cooking fire, or a proper lantern, but the conservation mode light of someone who was managing their power carefully. It did not move. He brought Carl forward and indicated 2 specific positions. Carl understood and moved immediately. Roy moved right without instruction, which was one of the things Roy was good at, reading spatial positioning without needing to be told. Graham moved left, into the tree line, and worked around the north side of the camp in a long, careful arc. The camp came into full view from the north, a single 4-season research tent in green, properly staked with tensioned guy lines, positioned with the entrance facing east. A camp stove on a flat stone to the east of the tent. A food bag hanging at the correct bear-safe height from a pine branch. 1 pair of walking boots outside the tent entrance. Graham stood in the northern tree line and read the camp. The boots outside the tent were significant. The person had come in from outside, removed their trail boots, and gone into the tent. That was recent behavior, within the last 2 or 3 hours, consistent with the timeline from the ravine. The mud disturbance at the entrance was consistent with someone who had come in quickly and not spent time outside the tent. He looked at the light inside the tent. It had not changed in the time he had been observing it. Same dim amber, same position, low on the floor. Not the lamp of someone who was settled and reading or eating. The lamp of someone who was sitting in the dark being careful about their energy use, which was either very experienced or very frightened, and the evidence in the ravine suggested the former. He thought about the situation carefully, the way he always thought about complications, which was without emotion and without haste. The cub was in the tent, that was a certainty. The person who had taken it was in the tent with it. The cub had value to the buyer, and the window was narrowing, and this complication needed to be resolved before the light came. He had 4 hours of darkness. He was patient. This kind of patience was not the patience of inaction. It was the patience of a man who knew that waiting in a good position was worth more than moving in a bad one. He had held positions longer than this for less reason. He found a cluster of pine roots on the north side of the camp that gave him a stable seated position and a clear sight line to the tent entrance, and he settled into it. The amber light inside the tent did not go out. He checked his watch. 12 past midnight. 3 hours and 51 minutes to first light. He made himself comfortable in the pine roots, and looked at the tent, and thought about nothing beyond the specific geometry of the next 4 hours, which he would work through one segment at a time, the way he always worked through anything that required patience. He was a patient man. He had always been a patient man. The light inside the tent stayed on, and Graham Bale sat in the dark with the frozen ground beneath him, and the cold pressing at him from all sides, and he watched the tent, and he waited. He checked his watch at 1 in the morning and revised his estimate. The light inside the tent had stayed on throughout the time he had been in position, which was now over an hour. That was not the behavior of a person who had gone to sleep. A sleeping person would have turned the lamp off. A person sitting in the dark conserving battery would have turned it off. The lamp being on told him the person inside was awake and doing something that required light. He thought about what that something might be, and the most likely answer was writing or radio work, and neither of those things was immediately alarming. What was somewhat more significant was the fact that the lamp had been off briefly, shortly after he had seen the person come back inside with the water pot, and then it had come back on. That transition suggested the person had turned it off to go dark, possibly to listen, possibly to test something, and then had decided that the light was more useful than the dark. That was the decision of a person who was thinking clearly under pressure, and clear thinking under pressure was a variable he had learned to factor into his estimates. He thought about clear thinkers. Clear thinkers were not necessarily a problem. What mattered was not how clearly the person inside the tent was thinking, but what resources that thinking had access to. A very clear thinker, with no resources, still had no resources. He had been in situations where the other party was significantly more capable than expected, and it had not changed the fundamental geometry, because capability without resources was not capability in any practical sense. He ran the resources. The person had a field radio. He knew the station was 4.5 kilometers north. He had scouted the station on 2 occasions, and he knew the staffing and the radio monitoring schedule, and the fact that the one remaining ranger covered a range that made close monitoring of the secondary channel at 2 in the morning unlikely. Field radio was a resource with a window, and the window was not currently open. The person might have a satellite communicator. Researchers in this region, at this level of institutional backing, frequently did. He knew the satellite schedule for this area. The next overhead window was, as of his last check, approximately 90 minutes away. 90 minutes. He factored that in. 90 minutes was a specific number with a specific implication. Before that window opened, the situation had one character. After it opened, the situation would have a different character. He preferred to be well into his current approach before the window opened, which meant the next 80 minutes were the operative window. He considered this carefully. Roy Sims was not going to be a problem on the timeline. Roy was impatient, and Roy said things at the wrong moments. But Roy did what he was told when Graham was firm about it. He had been firm about it tonight. Roy had held. Carl Eaton was always less certain. Carl was good in the field, the best of the three of them on silent movement and positioning, but Carl had a line that Graham had never been fully able to locate, a point past which Carl became unpredictable, and Graham had learned to watch for the signs of approach to that line. So far tonight Carl had been silent, which was either Carl being perfectly professional, or Carl being so far inside his own head that he wasn't giving Graham anything to read. He was not sure which. He settled deeper into the pine roots and thought about the next 80 minutes. He was patient. He had always been patient. The two attributes that had kept him clean for 22 years were patience and the ability to make accurate assessments of other people. Both would be required tonight. He was applying both. He checked his watch again. 1:07. 77 minutes to the satellite window, assuming a standard window schedule. He was going to use 75 of those minutes well, and then he was going to be in a different position. The amber light inside the tent did not go out. He looked at it through the pine boughs and he thought about the 80 minutes with the precise and patient attention he had always brought to the intervals between decisions, and he held his position. Mara pointed the audio recorder at the mesh ventilation port on the east wall of the tent and left it running. She had positioned it carefully, with the microphone head as close to the mesh as the design of the recorder would allow without touching it. The mesh was a small port, 10 centimeters across, and at distance, it would not pass much beyond ambient sound, but she was not after distance. She was after whatever was closest to the east wall of the tent, and she thought the east position was the one most likely to produce useful audio because she had identified it as Roy Sims's location, and Roy Sims had already spoken once, low and brief. If he spoke again, she wanted it on record. She turned the recorder's indicator light off with a strip of electrical tape from her repair kit. The recorder was running, but showed no visible sign of doing so. Then she sat back and thought about what she had and what she did not have. She had the satellite communicator, 2 hours and 14 minutes from a window. That was first. In 2 hours and 14 minutes she could reach the emergency satellite service and have a position fix and a transmission out in under 3 minutes. And after that, the situation would have changed in a specific and irreversible way. That was the anchor of her timeline. She had the field radio. Owen Hart monitored the secondary channel during his working hours, which she had never been able to fully predict. She had heard from him twice in 11 days, both times between 7 and 9 in the morning. It was now 12:32. She thought about trying the radio and decided against it. A transmission she sent might not reach Owen Hart. It might reach someone else. She preferred to have something definitive to transmit when she transmitted. She had the notebook, already serving its purpose. Third. She had the audio recorder, running. Fourth. She had the field knife in the side pocket of her pack. She was not going to think about the field knife anymore. She had put it in the mental category of last resort, and she was going to leave it there and focus on the options that came before last resort. She ran through her other physical resources. Headlamp, charged, 2 spare batteries for it. Her medical kit, which was not relevant to her immediate situation, but was a resource in a general sense. The emergency bivouac bag at the bottom of her pack, reflective, designed for unplanned overnight exposure. The emergency whistle on the zip of her pack's main compartment, rated at 120 decibels. She thought about the whistle. 120 decibels at this distance from the ranger station was not going to reach Owen Hart. 120 decibels might do other things. She set it aside. She thought about the Alpha. She had been thinking about the Alpha since the boot prints. In the specific way she had trained herself to think about data she did not want to misuse. Carefully, without building conclusions before the evidence supported them, maintaining the line between what she knew and what she hoped. But the line kept bringing her back to the same data. She opened her notebook to the territory mapping pages and looked at the pattern of position fixes she had accumulated over 11 days. Day 1. Alpha and 4 pack members at the main ridge, 700 meters north of this camp, moving north at 7:40. Day 3. Alpha scent post at the creek bed, 30 meters west of the tent, fresh sign. Day 5. Alpha crossing at the high saddle, moving east. Day 7. Alpha and full pack below the ridge above this camp, moving south, toward the ravine, 8:50 morning. Day 9. Alpha sign at the dry creek bed again. Same day. Camera trap on the ravine trail. Large male moving south at 23:40. Image quality low, but the size and gait were consistent. Day 11. This morning. Camera trap north of camp. Alpha moving north-northeast at 5:20. She looked at the map she had drawn from these fixes. 6 points. She had been using them to model territory boundaries. But looking at them now from a different angle, she saw something else. The points were not spread uniformly across the territory. They clustered. They clustered in a corridor that ran north-south, and the tent she was sitting in was roughly at the center of that corridor. Not at the edge, not in a peripheral zone, at the center. She thought about what it meant to be at the center of a wolf pack's core territory at 12:34 in the morning, with an injured cub belonging to that pack. She thought about this carefully, without hope and without conclusion, just holding the data and the proximity and what she knew about how wolf packs used their core territories at night. She put the notebook down. She looked at Coda. He was sitting upright on the sleeping bag, had been sitting upright since 12:17, with his nose pointed north, and his chest expanding in that slow, gathered way that had started when he woke. He was not asleep, and he was not agitated, and he was not behaving like an animal in distress, which was what she would have expected from an animal his age in his situation, if it had been responding only to the stimuli she could identify. Pain in the leg, strange environment, strange smell, loud sounds from outside. These things should have produced agitation in an animal this young. They had not produced anything of the kind. What she was watching was different. She had read the paper once, in her first year of graduate study. The single-author paper about deep contact communication in wolves that most of her colleagues considered speculative, and that had never been replicated. The author had described a specific class of vocalization that operated below the documented lower limit of wolf hearing, felt rather than heard, functioning between bonded individuals across distances that should have exceeded any normal communication range. She had filed the paper with the speculative ones, and had not thought about it much in 3 years. She was thinking about it now. She reached forward slowly, and placed her palm against Koda's side. His heartbeat came through her hand, and it was different from what she had felt when she was carrying him in from the ravine. That heartbeat had been fast and light, the heartbeat of an animal under sustained stress. This one was slow, very slow for an animal of his age and size. Not the slowness of sleep or illness or cold. Something else, something that had no good category in the literature. She left her hand on his side and watched his chest. The breath was still expanding, very slowly. She had been watching him for several minutes, and the inhalation had still not reached its peak. Whatever he was doing with that breath, it was not a normal breath in any sense she had a category for. She took her hand off his side. She sat back against the tent pole. Outside, from the north side of the camp, she heard something shift its weight on the frozen ground. Not Roy, not Carl, the north position. She had placed the north position as the patient voice, the flat, calm voice she had heard at 11:44. She filed the movement. At 12:38, Koda's chest finally reached full expansion. She could see it clearly in the amber light, the pale gray fur stretched tight over the rib cage, everything pressed to its maximum. The whole small body absolutely still at the top of the breath and waiting. He had been building to this for 21 minutes. She understood, sitting in the tent with her hands flat on her thighs and her recorder running on the east wall and the satellite window 1 hour and 59 minutes away, that whatever was about to happen was going to happen because of the animal sitting on her sleeping bag and not because of anything she had planned or prepared or decided. She sat back against the tent pole. She looked at the north wall of the tent. She took a breath. Outside, the 3 positions in the dark held their silence, and the forest held its breathing, and the cold deepened around the camp, and Koda sat with his chest full, and his eyes on the north wall, and his nose tracking something she could not find with any instrument she possessed. His mouth opened. She looked at the east wall of the tent where the audio recorder sat, and she thought about what it was capturing. The ambient sound through the mesh vent was not high quality. The vent was designed for airflow, not acoustics, and the mesh attenuated the higher frequencies while the canvas wall attenuated the lower ones. What the recorder was capturing was a middle band, movement sounds at close range, voices at medium range, clear speech at very close range. She was not going to get everything. She was going to get some things, and some things was better than nothing, and nothing was what she had started with 3 hours ago. She thought about the value of the recording. The recording would show the positions and the timing. It would show the circling behavior and the duration of the occupation. It would show the voice she had heard at 11:44, which had carried enough content to be interpreted as directing someone to hold position, which was itself a significant piece of information in the context of what else she had documented. Voice identification from recordings of this quality was not reliable enough for a legal threshold on its own, but it was corroborative, and corroboration built chains. She thought about chains. She had been thinking in terms of the immediate situation, which was what the immediate situation required, but a part of her was also thinking forward, past the satellite window, and past Owen Hart, and past the station, and into the category of what came next. What came next required records. She was a researcher. She made records. The records she had made tonight, in the notebook and in the audio recorder, and in the systematic attention she had paid to every sound and every position, were going to be useful records. She opened the notebook again and wrote 2 more pages. She wrote about the snare. She wrote about its condition, the rust on the trigger wire, and the mounting method, and the position against the root base, and the evidence that it had been in place for a significant period without inspection. She wrote about the specific species it was designed to catch, because a snare at that height and that anchor point in that kind of terrain was not for most of the species present in this forest. It was for a specific size range of animal, and the size range matched. She wrote the grid reference of the snare location again, more precisely this time, using the 3 coordinates she had recorded at the site. She wrote about what the snare told her. Not just that it was there, but what its presence implied. A snare that had not been inspected in weeks, still required someone to set it originally. Setting a snare in this location required knowledge of the terrain, and knowledge of the pack's movement patterns, and knowledge of which part of the pack's territory would be used by young animals traveling independently, which was a specific and detailed kind of knowledge. She wrote that down. She thought about who had that kind of knowledge. She thought about researchers. She thought about gamekeepers. She thought about people who had spent significant time in this specific section of forest before she arrived. People who knew where the young animals moved, and what the terrain looked like at the base of that ravine, and where the root structures provided anchor points at the right height and angle. She wrote, "Whoever set the snare in the ravine had detailed knowledge of this pack's territory, likely acquired through extended time in the area. This is consistent with the systematic nature of the approach tonight." She underlined that sentence. Then she closed the notebook and sat back and listened. The satellite window was 1 hour and 21 minutes away. She thought about the Alpha's Day 11 data. The camera trap on the trail north of camp had caught him at 5:20 this morning, moving north-northeast. That was his direction of travel when she last had data on him. North-northeast from this camp, following the ridge. She had her ridge data from day 5, the Alpha crossing the high saddle at 6:15, moving east, and from day 1, the Alpha and 4-pack members at the main ridge, 700 meters north of this camp, moving north. She built the pattern in her head. The Alpha used the ridge as a corridor. He moved along the ridge in both directions, using it the way large animals use elevated terrain, as a transit route that provided sight lines and minimal vegetation resistance. The ridge above this camp connected west to the high saddle and east to the main ridge system that ran north. Both ends of the ridge were within what her data defined as his core territory. He could be anywhere on that ridge right now. She thought about how fast an adult wolf in good condition covered ridge terrain at night. She had data from 4 previous studies, and the numbers averaged at approximately 12 kilometers per hour for sustained movement on clear terrain. The ridge above the camp was approximately 300 meters above her position in altitude. Call it 400 meters of actual ground distance at the ridge angle. At 12 kilometers per hour, that distance was covered in 2 minutes. She sat with that calculation for a moment. 2 minutes. She was not building on that calculation. She was not allowing that calculation to become something it was not, which was hope. She was simply holding the number. The satellite window was 1 hour and 19 minutes away. She thought about that number again. 1 hour and 19 minutes. She held it the way she had been holding numbers all night, not to comfort herself with them, but to use them. Numbers were anchors. They were the thing in the dark that did not move. She had an anchor. She had audio recording running. She had a full field record in the notebook. She had the cub, who was breathing, whose leg was not broken. She had all of these things. And now Coda had his mouth open. Coda opened his mouth. The sound came out of him, like something that had been stored there, not like something he decided to produce. It went up through the canvas of the tent roof, without any resistance, and out into the dark above the pines, and beyond them, into the cold black air above the ridge, and it kept going. She had heard wolf calls on recordings, and she had heard them in the field through observation distance, and she had heard them through the walls of a hide. She had never heard one at this range, inside the same space as the animal producing it, and it was not the same experience as those other experiences. It was physical, in a way that recordings did not capture, and distance filtered out, a resonance that she felt in her chest, and behind her sternum, and in the bones of her face, and it lasted 4 seconds, possibly 5, a clean and carrying and absolutely certain sound. Then it was done, and the tent went silent. She did not breathe. Outside, nothing moved. The wind in the pines, which had been the constant backdrop of the night, simply stopped. Not gradually. It stopped, as though the air itself had decided to be still so it could better carry what was coming next. 4 seconds of absolute silence. Then the mountain answered. It came from the north first, from high on the main ridge above the camp, a voice that was deep and sustained, and had in it the same quality of certainty she had felt in Coda's call, but different in character, older, weighted with the particular authority that comes from years of knowing a territory completely. She felt it in her chest, before it became a sound she could consciously categorize. It rolled off the ridge and down through the forest, and through the camp, and kept going south toward the ravine. Then a second voice from the west, lower in elevation, nearer to the creek bed. A different pitch, but the same quality of response. The same sense of a signal received and answered without hesitation. She was not recording this voice at close range but through the east wall vent of the tent, and she was aware in a separate part of her mind that the audio recorder was capturing what the audio recorder could capture, and that what she was hearing in the tent was something larger than what any recording was going to contain. A third voice from further east, from the direction of the high saddle, then a fourth from higher on the western ridge, answering the third, then a fifth, further north along the ridge line. She sat with her hands flat on her thighs, and listened to the mountain fill with sound, and felt it, each voice coming into the space, and layering with the others, the way instruments do in a piece of music that was not written down anywhere, but that everyone present knew. She counted, 3 confirmed, 4, a fifth that might have been the echo of the fourth off the ridge face. She counted it separately, because she had learned to count these conservatively. 5 confirmed voices. She knew the pack had 11 members. She thought about where 11 animals would be during a night transit of their core territory, and she thought about the shape of the territory she had mapped, and she thought about the convergence direction of the voices, which was not random. They were not calling from fixed positions and answering outward. They were calling while moving, and the movement had a direction. The direction was south. Outside, from the east side of the camp, she heard Roy Sims. She could not get the words. She could get the voice, and the voice had changed. Earlier in the night when she had heard Roy move, and the one time he had spoken to Graham, she had heard a man who was irritated and impatient, but fundamentally confident in his position. What she heard now was not that. It had a quality she recognized from voices under sudden new information. The particular way a voice shifts when the thing it was certain about has become uncertain, and the certainty has not yet been replaced by anything else. Graham's response came immediately. 1 word, possibly 2. The same flat, patient tone as before, which was itself a kind of information. Graham was not reacting to the calls the way Roy was. Graham was reacting to Roy, which meant that whatever Graham was thinking about the voices on the mountain, he was already past the initial response and into the management phase, and managing Roy was now his primary concern. Carl said nothing. Carl had been silent for most of the night, and the silence from the south was a specific quality that she had been filing since she first confirmed that position. It was not the silence of a man who was not paying attention. It was the silence of a man who was paying very close attention and had concluded that silence was the best response to what he was paying attention to. The 5 voices on the mountain were still moving south. She could tell by the way the character of each successive call changed slightly, the shift in direction and distance that meant the source was not stationary. Each call came from a point fractionally closer than the last. She had documented this in 2 other pack studies, what the literature called convergent vocalization during night approach, and it had a very specific profile that she was now listening to in real time from inside the target of the approach. She thought about Owen Hart. She thought about the satellite window in 1 hour and 41 minutes. Then the 5 voices fell silent, all at once, mid-approach. She had been tracking them, and they had been getting closer, and then they stopped, and the silence they left was different from the silence before the call. Before the call, the forest had been silent, the way it is always silent at this hour, with its own texture and its own depth. This silence was the silence of a specific number of large animals choosing to go quiet simultaneously, and it had a presence to it that the forest's ordinary silence did not have. She waited. Outside, Roy Sims said something to Graham that she did not catch, and she did not try to catch because something else was happening that required her full attention. The small sounds of the forest, the insects and the tiny movements in the undergrowth, and the birds settling on branches, sounds that had been absent since the men took their positions around the camp, came back briefly. For about 10 seconds the baseline reasserted itself. Then it cut off again, sharply, more suddenly than she had heard it cut off all night. She pressed her hand flat on the tent floor. The vibration was there. She had to focus to find it, because it was very subtle, a tiny, regular, almost imperceptible trembling in the frozen earth below the tent floor. She moved her hand slightly and found it again, regular, rhythmic, consistent with something heavy moving across frozen ground at a slow and deliberate pace. She counted the rhythm, long pauses between pulses, not a trot, not any kind of running gait. This was a walk, each foot placed with full weight, each step complete, before the next began. She had felt ground vibrations from large animals before, deer at close range, the one time she had been near a reindeer herd on a muddy autumn plain in Scandinavia. This was heavier than any of those. It was coming from the north. From above the camp, from the direction of the ridge, Roy Sims's flashlight came on. The beam swept across the north tree line hard and fast, and held there, and she saw the tent fabric light up from it, the green going pale in the reflected glow. She heard Roy inhale as the light hit the tree line. The intake of breath lasted about half a second, and then he went silent. She did not need to be outside to know what the flashlight had shown him. The flashlight went out. Outside, in the clearing, a silence fell that was different in quality from any of the silences she had heard all night. She had been tracking the quality of silences all night, cataloging them, and this one had a category she had not used yet. It was the silence of a space that has been redrawn. Roy Sims did not speak. Graham did not speak. Carl did not speak. The ground vibration continued, getting stronger, coming south off the ridge, unhurried, one deliberate step at a time. Then at the north tree line, in the dark after the flashlight went out, the eyes appeared. She could not see them directly, because she was inside the tent. She knew they were there, because the tent fabric lit in the ambient glow of 7 points of reflected light at the northern tree line, barely visible even in darkness, amber in the dark, placed at heights ranging from low near the ground to nearly eye level for a standing person. She could not count them precisely from inside. She counted the lit points on the north tent wall and reached 7 before the fabric moved slightly in a draft, and she lost the count. 7 pairs. She sat in the tent with her hands on her thighs, and her recorder running, and 7 pairs of amber eyes at the north tree line of her camp, and the weight of something very large coming down off the ridge toward her, and she sat completely still, and watched the north wall of the tent, and breathed. She sat very still and let the mountain answer. The voices were not answering her. She understood that in the same way she understood everything about the past several hours, not intellectually first, but in the body, in the chest, the way you understand things that are not primarily intellectual. The voices were answering Coda. The cub had sent his call through the roof of the tent and into the cold dark above the ridge, and the pack had heard it. And what she was listening to was the response to that. And the response was not, "We are here." The response was, "We are coming." She thought about what that meant for the timeline. The satellite window was 1 hour and 3 minutes away. She did not need the satellite window to be the thing that changed the situation anymore. The situation had changed in the time it took a 10-week-old cub to take a breath and release it, and the satellite window was now something different, not a lifeline but a record. She would use it to make a record, which was what records were for, and in the meantime what was happening on the mountain was happening. The third voice came from the east, from the direction of the high saddle, where she had data for the Alpha on day 5. She thought about that. The high saddle was 2 kilometers east. An animal moving south from the saddle, at a running pace in clear mountain terrain, could cover that distance in 12 minutes, maybe 10. She did not know if this voice was from an animal at the saddle, or from an animal that had already been moving south when the call arrived, and was now closer. The fourth and fifth voices came within seconds of each other, from the western ridge, layered, distinct. She had 5 confirmed voices now, and her count was conservative. Outside, Roy Sims was losing the quality of his silence. She had been tracking Roy's silence all night, as a specific texture in the field of sound that surrounded the tent. Roy's silence had been a certain kind of silence, the silence of a man who was holding position and maintaining a choice. What she was hearing now was the silence of a man who was no longer fully in control of his choice, the silence of someone who was being held in position by something external rather than something internal. And the external thing was Graham's instruction to stay, and the internal thing was becoming something different. She thought about what happened when those 2 things came apart. From the west side of the clearing, still within the camp perimeter, she heard something move. Not a person. The ground vibration had a different character from boot falls on frozen earth. This was lighter, more distributed, multiple contact points rather than 2. She tracked it with her hand flat on the tent floor, and identified the direction, west to north, moving along the tree line. One of the pack had moved position. She counted what she had, 7 pairs of eyes at the north tree line, when the flashlight had swept through, but that had been before the call. and things were different after the call. Animals that had been holding positions at the tree line were now in different positions. She was certain of that. And the positions they were taking were not away from the camp. She thought about the word encircle. She thought about it carefully, with the same precision she tried to apply to every categorization she made in the field. Encircle implied intent, and intent was a human category that did not translate cleanly to animal behavior. What the data suggested was more neutral and more factual. Multiple pack members were taking positions around the camp perimeter, and the camp perimeter included the positions where the 3 men were standing. That was a factual description. The alpha was coming off the ridge. She could feel the vibration more clearly now. It had stopped being the background uncertainty she had first detected, and had become a specific, located, regularly pulsing thing that her hand on the tent floor could follow as clearly as she could follow a voice. 8 pulses, 9, 10, each slightly more distinct than the last, each adding a small increment to the certainty of approach. Outside, Roy Sims said something that she did not fully hear, because the wind had started again in the upper pines, and the sound moved through it in fragments. But the fragments were enough. They had the quality of a statement, not a question, and the statement was directed at Graham, and Graham's response was immediate and brief and flat. Roy went quiet. Carl said nothing. The 5 voices on the mountain were closer than the last time she had assessed them, and the assessment felt almost continuous now, the way a moving object seems almost continuous when it is moving directly toward you. She sat in the tent with both hands flat on the floor, and felt the mountain moving. The eyes at the tree line did not move. She built the count from what she could see reflected against the tent fabric, and what she knew from the brief moment of the flashlight, and she reached 7. 7 pairs of eyes at the northern edge of the camp, distributed from low to high, covering the full width of the tree line. They were not blinking, or if they were blinking she could not detect it at this distance through this fabric. They were simply held in position, each pair at its chosen height, fixed on the space in front of them. She thought about their heights. The lowest pair was at the level she associated with the younger subadults, the animals she estimated at 2 to 3 years old, who had not yet reached full adult stature. The highest pair was adult height, a tall adult, and she thought about which of the 11 pack members would place eyes that high at resting posture. She thought about the data from her physical measurements and the photographs and the camera trap images. She put the highest eyes with the largest of the pack's adult females, who she had documented twice at the upper ridge during daylight. The second highest pair she could not place with certainty. She noted that none of the eyes were directed at the tent. They were directed at the clearing, at the 3 positions where the men stood. Outside, Roy Sims breathed. She had been listening to Roy all night, and she knew his breath patterns well enough by now to read them. The breath she heard was the breath of a man whose assessment of a situation has just changed substantially, and who has not yet decided what to do about it. It was quick and involuntary, the kind of breath that happens before conscious control can intervene, and it told her more about Roy Sims than anything she had heard from him all night. Graham's voice came immediately after, flat, 1 word, possibly 2. The quality of Graham's voice had not changed significantly, but something had shifted in it that she was trying to name. Earlier in the night, she had heard patience in it. What she heard now was patience, in a mode she would describe as managed, the patience of someone who is applying patience deliberately, rather than feeling it naturally. "Hold your position," she thought he said. Roy went quiet. Carl, on the south side of the camp, was still completely silent, and the quality of Carl's silence had been changing over the last 30 minutes, in a way she could not entirely characterize. It was not the same silence it had been at 11 o'clock. Something in its texture had shifted. She thought about that, and set it aside. The ground vibration continued from the north. She had been tracking it since she first felt it through the tent floor, and she had been counting its rhythm in a loose way, not formally because the rhythm was too variable for a formal count, but trying to estimate the pace. Each pulse was separated from the last by approximately 2 seconds. A large animal moving at a deliberate walking pace, unhurried, each step placed with full intention. She thought about what she knew of wolf locomotion and the energy efficiency of a paced walk in an experienced adult, which was designed for distance and endurance and not for speed. And she thought about what that pace, at that weight, coming down the north slope toward the camp, meant about the animal behind it. He knew where he was going. There was no uncertainty in the movement. She had spent enough time in the field listening to animals approach their destinations versus listening to animals moving without specific intent, and these footsteps had the character of the first kind. This was directed movement, one step at a time, each placed with complete certainty about what was below it and what was ahead. Roy Sims's flashlight came on for the second time. This time the beam went north-northeast, away from the tree line, directed up the slope toward the ridge, searching for what was making the sound she could feel through the tent floor. The flashlight was useful to her for a different reason. It lit the north tent wall clearly enough that she could see the silhouettes of individual branches against the fabric, and for a moment, she thought she could see, in the upper right corner of the north wall, the shadow of something at the ridge edge, large and still, before the beam moved off it. The flashlight went out. Roy Sims said something to Graham. She got more of this one than the earlier exchanges, something about the ridge. Graham's response was immediate and flat, and she got only one word from it, which was the same word she had been getting from Graham all night when Roy spoke. She knew what the word was by its shape in the air, even though it was too quiet to carry the consonants cleanly. Stay. Carl said nothing. She thought about Carl saying nothing. Carl had not spoken once all night. He had moved once, the repositioning from the south position to an area she placed near the western tree line, which she had detected at around 12:40. After that, he had been still, not talking, not moving, no sounds she could place. Just present and quiet on the west-southwest side of the camp. The ground vibration intensified. She put her hand flat on the tent floor. The pulse was clear now, each step registering distinctly, no longer something she had to concentrate to find. She counted 4 steps, 5, 6, and with each step, the next was slightly more distinct than the last. She estimated the source was now within 200 meters, and closing, which meant whatever was coming off that ridge was going to be in the camp clearing in minutes. She looked at Coda. He had not moved. He was still sitting upright on the sleeping bag, with his nose pointed north-northeast, and his eyes forward, and his injured paw resting lightly on the sleeping bag surface. He had not flinched at Roy's flashlight. He had not reacted to the voices outside. He was sitting in a state of focus so complete that it seemed to have made the tent and the lamp and everything else peripheral. She looked at the north wall of the tent. The eyes at the tree line had not moved. 7 pairs of amber light points reflected on the fabric, still and exactly placed. Then Carl Eaton made a sound. It lasted less than a second. It was not a word, and not a phrase, and not any vocalization she had a clear category for. It was involuntary in character, the kind of sound the body produces when the gap between what it expected and what it is receiving has become too large for the usual filters. She filed it. Then Carl went completely silent again. The footsteps from the ridge stopped. She sat in the tent, and every part of her listening was directed outward through the tent walls, and she heard nothing. The footsteps had stopped. The ground vibration was still. The eyes at the tree line were still. The 3 positions outside were still. Everything was still. She waited. 10 seconds, 15, 20. The silence of the clearing was absolute in a way she had not heard all night, not even at the deepest hours, because this silence was inhabited by a very large number of living things that had all made the same decision at the same moment, which was to hold their positions and wait. Then a shadow crossed the north wall of the tent. It came from the left side of the wall and moved to the right, slow and continuous, and it was not the shadow of any branch or any movement of the night sky. It had the shape that a body makes when it passes between a light source and a surface, and the light source was what remained of the ambient night sky above the ridge, and the body was moving from west to east along the north wall of the tent, and it was large. She tracked the shadow as it crossed the wall. It took approximately 3 seconds to move from one edge to the other. She processed the size of the shadow, the height of it, the depth of it at the shoulder level. The processing was automatic and precise, and she did not let it become anything other than data. The shadow cleared the east edge of the north wall and moved around the corner of the tent. She tracked it in her head, moving south now, along the east wall, between the tent and Roy Sims's position. She listened for Roy. She did not hear him. Then the shadow cleared the east wall and moved into the space in front of the tent entrance, the open clearing to the east of the tent, and she lost the shadow because there was no wall left to cast it on. There was just the entrance zip in front of her, and the dark outside it, and a silence that had become so total It was its own kind of sound. She looked at the zip. She looked at the north wall. She looked at Coda, who had not moved. Then from the clearing directly in front of the tent entrance, 4 meters away or 5, she heard breathing. It was slow and deep, and it had a size to it that none of the other sounds of the night had had. Each breath was full and complete, and it came and went, like the movement of something large and utterly certain of where it was and why it was there. The Alpha had entered the clearing. She pressed her hand against the tent floor and tracked the Alpha's approach by vibration. 8 steps. She counted 8 distinct pulses before the footsteps stopped at the top of the ridge, and she lost the count in the transition to whatever happened next. She waited. The silence after the footsteps stopped was different from the silence before they started. Before, the forest had been silent with the silence of things that were holding still. Now the silence had a new element, the silence of something large that had arrived at a specific position and stopped there, and the quality of arrival was in it. She thought he was on the ridge above the camp, not at the camp yet, on the ridge, at the crest, looking down at what was below him. She thought about what he would see. He would see the camp from above, which was a different view from the view she had from inside it. From above, the clearing would be a small opening in the forest canopy, the tent, a dark green shape on its floor, the surrounding pines closing over everything beyond the clearing's edge. He would see the 3 men in the dark, and he had been watching men in this territory for years, and he knew the difference between a researcher with a tripod and a man with a different kind of purpose. She wondered if she was projecting. She thought about it carefully. She was projecting if she was ascribing human cognitive categories to an animal that did not have them. She was not projecting if she was recognizing that animals which have spent years in contact with human beings develop highly accurate models of human behavior, models built from direct experience and not from reasoning, in the way that all animal learning builds models from direct experience. The Alpha had experience with researchers. She had found sign of at least 2 previous study seasons in this territory, which meant the Alpha had been near researcher camps before and had built whatever model his experience had given him. She was not projecting. She was applying the data. Roy Sims's flashlight came on and went north-northeast, up the slope, toward the ridge. The beam swept through the upper air, and she saw the tent fabric brighten from the reflected glow. The beam held for 3 seconds, then it went out. Roy made a sound after the light went out that she could not have described to anyone who had not also heard it, but that she identified without any uncertainty, as the sound of a person whose model of the situation has just received information it was not prepared for. Graham's voice came immediately. Same flat quality. 1 word. She thought, stay. Roy Sims stayed. Carl Eaton was still entirely silent. She had been trying to read Carl's silence all night, and she could not fully read it, which she had decided was information in itself. Carl's silence was too complete. Roy's silence had texture, had moments where she could hear what was underneath it. Carl's silence was sealed in a way that suggested a person who had made a decision not to give the space around him anything to read. That was not the silence of someone holding a position. That was the silence of someone who had already decided to leave it. She filed that thought and held it. The ground vibration resumed. Not from the ridge this time, from the clearing side of the slope, from a point that was lower than the ridge crest and moving lower still, 1 step at a time. He had come down off the ridge and was now on the camp slope, approaching the north edge of the clearing. She counted the steps. 12, 15. The clarity of each pulse increasing with each count. 20. Then the shadow crossed the north wall of the tent. She had been watching the north wall and she saw it come. A shape against the fabric, not made of light but made of the absence of the ambient glow from the sky outside. A body-shaped absence moving from left to right across the upper portion of the north wall. She tracked it. It moved at walking pace, steady and unhurried, and it was large in the way she had been calculating from 11 days of data, but that data had not prepared her for the difference between knowing something and being in proximity to the thing you know. 3 seconds to cross the width of the north wall. She had measured the north wall. She knew its width. She could estimate the size of whatever had made that shadow from the time it took to cross it, and the height at which the shadow appeared on the fabric. She did not do the calculation right now. She held the information and kept listening. The shadow cleared the east edge of the north wall. The breathing from the east side of the camp, which had been Roy Sims's breathing for most of the night, was not Roy Sims's breathing now. Something else had entered the space on the east side, and the breathing she was hearing was different from Roy's in every quality. The rhythm, the depth, the relationship of the exhale to the inhale. Roy's breath had been the breath of a large man at rest who was not resting. What she was hearing now was something entirely different. She looked at the tent entrance. The Alpha was in the clearing. She knew what he looked like. She had never been this close. In 11 days of fieldwork, she had managed 2 clear sightings, both through the long lens, at distances that put him well outside the range where physical presence means what it means at close range. She had studied every image she had, every track, every camera trap frame, every piece of sign she had found and measured. She had built a picture of him from data that was precise in the way field data is precise, calibrated and documented and cross-referenced. She thought she knew what she had documented. What was standing 4 or 5 meters in front of the tent entrance was on the other side of that documentation. She could not see him. She was behind a layer of tent fabric, and the lamp inside was dimmer than the ambient dark outside by this hour, and seeing through a tent wall in this configuration was not possible. What she had was sound and vibration, and the particular quality of the air, and that was enough. His breathing set the scale. Each breath was deep and slow and fully committed. The breathing of a body that was very large and very relaxed. And she could hear within that breathing something that was not quite sound, and not quite air pressure, but a combination of the two that arrived in her sternum, and stayed there. She had read in a paper that she had considered speculative, that the frequency range of mature wolf breathing at close range extended into the subsonic. She was reconsidering the speculative classification. He was between the tent entrance and the 3 men who had surrounded the camp. She understood his position from the location of the breathing, and the information she had about where the men were. He was in the open ground of the clearing, directly east of the tent entrance, and he was facing away from the tent. He was facing the clearing and the men in the dark at the edges of it. He had positioned himself between the tent and the men. She sat with that for a moment. The 7 wolves at the northern tree line were still there. She could tell by the tent wall. 7 reflected amber points still at the tree line, still not at the tent, still facing outward. The pack held its positions on the perimeter, while the Alpha stood in the center of the clearing, between the tent and the men. Graham Bale was on the north side of the camp. She heard Graham move. It was a careful, deliberate movement of a specific kind. She had heard enough of Graham's movements tonight to have a feel for their character, and this one was different from the repositioning sounds or the weight shifts she had catalogued. This was a raising movement, the sound of weight being lifted and adjusted, the sound of a 2-armed grip changing to a supported one, the particular set of small sounds that accompany a person raising a rifle from a low carry to an aimed position. She did not have to guess about the safety. She had heard the safety at 11:46, when the clicks had been 2 in succession, the first, the initial check, and the second, the final disengagement. She had catalogued both sounds with their times. She thought about what was between Graham's rifle and the tent. 4 or 5 meters of open ground, and in that ground, an alpha wolf of a size she had been trying to calculate for 11 days and now, listening to the breathing 4 meters away through a tent wall, thought she had been underestimating. 30 seconds passed. Neither the rifle nor the Alpha moved. She thought about 30 seconds and what it meant in this context. 30 seconds of a rifle being held at aim toward a target is a long time. The muscles involved in holding a rifle steady are not designed for extended static load, and they make corrections, constant tiny corrections, and those corrections are audible at close range if you are listening for them. She was listening for them. She heard one at approximately the 10-second mark, slight, automatic. She did not hear another. Graham was steadier than she had expected. The Alpha breathed. From the eastern tree line, Roy Sims made a sound. It was not a word and not a breath, it was something between them, brief and involuntary, and it was the sound of someone who has been watching something for 30 seconds, and whose body has overridden the decision to stay silent. She heard Graham register the sound and she heard him not respond to it, and she understood from that silence what Graham's priority was. The rifle, the aim, the calculation he was running, whatever that calculation was. She thought about what calculation you run when you are holding a rifle aimed at an animal that is positioned between you and your objective, and when the pack of that animal is holding the perimeter of the space around you. She thought about what calculation you run when you are a patient man and the situation has become one in which patience is no longer a sufficient response. She looked at the zip of the tent entrance. She looked at Coda. Kota was still sitting on the sleeping bag with his pale gold eyes directed at the east wall of the tent, and his small injured paw resting lightly on the surface. He had been in this state of gathered attention since 12:17, nearly 90 minutes, and he had not moved for any of what had happened outside in that time. He had not moved at the 5 voices on the mountain. He had not moved at Roy's flashlight, or Graham's instruction, or the ground vibration of the Alpha's approach. He moved now. A small motion, barely visible. He turned his head slightly, until his nose was pointed at the east wall of the tent, the wall nearest the clearing where the Alpha was standing, and then he made a sound. Very small, very quiet. She would not have heard it at any distance greater than the length of the tent. It was the sound a young wolf makes when it wants a specific known individual to know exactly where it is. Not a call, and not an alarm, but something between a location signal and a greeting. Something that existed in the private vocabulary between bonded animals, and did not carry any content beyond, "Here. I am here." She heard the Alpha's breathing change. It was not a dramatic change. It was not a change that anyone who had not been listening to that breathing for the last several minutes with full focus would have detected. A fraction more depth to the next inhalation. A change in the quality of the exhale. Something had shifted in the attention behind the breathing, and what had shifted was that the total focus on the men in the clearing had been interrupted by a fraction of a second of recognition. The recognition of a sound that came from inside the tent. From the sleeping bag on the floor. From the small gray cub that had been in this pack's territory until someone cut a wire in a ravine 3 hours ago and carried him north. She heard Graham Bale's rifle shift. Not much. 2 inches, maybe 3, downward from the aimed position. And she heard the fraction of a second of muscle correction that came after a voluntary movement in an aimed limb, the body trying to re-establish what the mind had just overridden. The barrel was lower. She could not determine exactly where it was aimed now. She thought, lower, 2 or 3 inches, somewhere between the Alpha and the ground. She thought about those 2 or 3 inches. She thought about the sound Kota had made, and the change in the breathing, and the 2 or 3 inches of barrel drop, and she thought about what connected all 3 of those things. She looked at the east wall of the tent. Outside in the clearing, 4 or 5 meters from where she sat, the Alpha was standing between the tent and the man with the rifle, and the man with the rifle had lowered it by 2 or 3 inches after a 10-week-old cub made a quiet sound through a layer of canvas, and nobody was moving. The 7 eyes at the northern tree line held their positions. Graham Bale held his position. The Alpha held his position. Kota sat on the sleeping bag looking at the east wall of the tent. She sat with her hands flat on her thighs, and the audio recorder running on the east wall vent and the satellite window 57 minutes away, and she watched the tent walls and listened to the breathing 4 or 5 meters away, and she did not move, and the clearing held its breath, and the mountain waited. She sat in the amber light of the lamp and listened to the breathing outside the tent entrance and thought about what it communicated. She had spent 4 years listening to this species. She had spent 4 years in various kinds of proximity to this species, recording its sounds and its movements, and building the category system that field research builds from repeated observation, the set of patterns that let you translate between what you hear and what it means. She was applying that system now to the breathing outside the tent entrance. What the breathing communicated was not aggression. She knew what aggressive breathing sounded like in this species. She had heard it from the recordings she studied, and from the one live encounter she had in year 2, when a pack member had scented her from upwind and advanced toward the hide, before catching her human smell at close range and withdrawing. That had been fast and sharp and high in its quality, breath used as part of a display, breath that communicated readiness. This was not that. This was slow and deep and completely level, the breathing of an animal that was not displaying but simply standing. Standing in a specific place for a specific reason, with no urgency about the reason, no sense that the reason needed to be performed or communicated through anything beyond the presence itself. He was just there. She thought about the rifle on the north side of the camp, and the 22-year history of the man holding it, and the calculation she assumed he was running. And she thought about what had just happened to that calculation. The 7 wolves at the northern tree line, the 4 or 5 other voices she had confirmed on the mountain. The Alpha in the clearing between the tent and the men, the cub in the tent making a sound through the canvas. A 22-year history was a significant investment, People with significant investments in a specific structure of behavior did not abandon that structure easily. They looked for ways to protect it. She thought about what Graham Bale was looking for in this clearing, in this moment. The path through the situation that preserved what he had built. She thought about whether such a path existed. She thought about this honestly, and without the particular kind of thinking that distorts honest analysis, the thinking that arrives at a preferred conclusion and works backward from it. She tried to think about it the way a man with a rifle and a 22-year investment and a clear and patient mind would think about it. He was looking at an alpha wolf of significant size positioned between him and the tent he needed to access, with a pack at the perimeter, and a cub inside the tent that had just announced its location through a layer of canvas. He had Carl on the south side who had not spoken in 2 hours. He had Roy on the east side who was losing the quality of his silence. He had a satellite window opening in 51 minutes that the person in the tent was going to use to transmit a detailed account of the last 4 hours. She thought, he is looking for the same thing she was looking for at 11 o'clock. A path through the situation that preserved the investment. She had spent an hour and a half at 11 o'clock looking for such a path. She had not found one that did not require the satellite window. The satellite window was what ended the uncertainty. She wondered if Graham Bale had already understood that. She wondered if his rifle being up was not the action of a man who had found a path, but the action of a man who was still looking for one and holding the rifle while he looked. 32 seconds of standoff. She counted them. Coda made his small sound, the private location signal that went through the canvas and into the clearing and arrived at the specific receiver it had been addressed to, and she heard the Alpha's breathing change in the fraction of a second after Coda's sound, and she thought about what that change meant in terms of the calculation she was imagining Graham Bale to be running. His calculation included rifle, pack, alpha, cub, tent, satellite window in 50 minutes, researcher inside the tent who had been awake and documenting all night. After Coda's sound, his calculation included one more variable. The Alpha now knew that the cub was in the tent and knew precisely where in the tent it was, and that variable changed the weight of every other variable in the calculation because it told Graham what the Alpha was going to do if the calculation resolved in a specific direction. She heard the rifle drop 2 inches. She sat with the sound of that 2-inch drop and understood it for what it was. Not surrender, not a final decision, but the recalibration of a calculation that had just received information it was not prepared for. The rifle was still up, just 2 inches lower. Graham was still in his position, just slightly different from where he had been. She looked at the tent wall. She looked at Coda. She thought, 49 minutes was still 49 minutes. The number had not changed. The satellite window was still there, at the far end of those 49 minutes, unchanged by anything that had happened in the clearing since 1:15. She was going to be at the communicator when the window opened. That was what she was going to do. She sat in the amber light and waited for the recalibration outside the tent to finish. She sat in the amber light of the lamp with her hands flat on her thighs and the audio recorder running on the east wall vent and the satellite window 49 minutes away, and she waited for the recalibration to finish. Carl Eaton spoke first. His voice came from the west side of the clearing, not the south where she had spent all night placing him. He had moved at some point in the last 20 minutes without her detecting it, which she noted and added to what she knew about Carl. A man who could reposition that silently on frozen ground in this cold had done this kind of thing before. He had moved from the south toward the western tree line, toward the path that led back to the main trail, before anyone had given him a reason to do so. She thought about the sequence of that. He had moved west before the Alpha entered the clearing, before the rifle went up. He had moved west while the voices were still on the mountain, while there was still noise to cover the movement. He had been making a decision for a long time. He said 3 words. The air was very clear and very still after the Alpha's arrival, and the 3 words crossed the clearing cleanly and came through the tent wall without any significant degradation. She heard them as clearly as she had heard anything all night. He said, "I am done." Then his footsteps moved west. They had the quality she had already identified as characteristic of Carl, quiet and deliberate and without hesitation, and they moved from the western edge of the clearing into the western tree line, and then the pines received them, and the sound diminished slowly over about 30 seconds, and then was gone. Nothing in the clearing responded to them. Graham Bale did not speak. Roy Sims did not speak. The Alpha did not move. The 7 pairs of eyes at the northern tree line did not move. Every element of the clearing held its position, while Carl Eaton's footsteps diminished into the forest, and then the clearing accepted his absence and went on. 28 seconds. She counted them, because she needed to count something, and counting was the thing she had been doing all night to keep her processing clear. At 28 seconds, Roy Sims moved. He did not announce himself. He did not speak. His footsteps came from the eastern side of the clearing, from where she had placed him for most of the night, and they moved west, following the same direction Carl had taken. The pace was slightly faster than Carl's, not dramatically, perhaps 15% faster, the pace of a man who had arrived at the same destination by a different route and did not need as much time to confirm the decision was final. The footsteps crossed the clearing and went into the western tree line and faded in approximately the same way Carl's had faded, over 30 seconds or slightly less, and then they were gone. The clearing contained 2 presences now. She could tell by the quality of the silence, which was different from all the previous silences of the night. The presence of multiple people changes the texture of a silence, the way multiple instruments change the silence between notes. 2 people make a different kind of silence than 3, and 1 person makes a different kind than 2. She was hearing 1 person's silence and 1 wolf's silence in the clearing, and those 2 silences were nothing like each other. She focused on Graham Bale. She heard him breathe. Once. The slow, controlled breath of a man regulating his body. She heard him shift his weight, a fraction to the left, a rebalancing. She heard the rifle, still in his hands. She heard him breathe again. He was thinking. She had spent a night listening to Graham Bale think, and she had learned that Graham's thinking was not impulsive. He was not going to do anything until he had run the calculation to completion. She had heard him override Roy 3 times, and not speak when Carl moved west, and not react to the voices on the mountain with anything beyond a flat instruction to stay. He was a man who did not move until the movement was certain. She watched the north wall of the tent and listened. The Alpha took a step. She felt it through the tent floor at the same moment she heard it. Not a charging step, not an aggressive step. A single, deliberate, forward step in the direction of the north side of the camp, toward Graham. Graham took a step back. She heard both steps, the forward one and the backward one, and then the silence after them. And in that silence, the distance between the Alpha and Graham was the same as it had been before the step, but their positions in the clearing had changed. Then the Alpha took another step forward. Graham took another step back. She counted. First exchange. Both moved. Positions shifted. Alpha north. Graham further north. Second exchange. The same. Third. She heard the change in the quality of Graham's retreating footstep, the first sign that the ground beneath it was different from the open clearing ground, the beginning of the tree line, the edge of the forest. Fourth exchange. She heard a root under Graham's boot. Fifth. Sixth. After the 6th exchange, Graham was in the eastern tree line. She could hear the difference in how his footsteps sounded on the denser ground between the trees, the way the pine needles and the tighter frieze of the shaded earth changed the acoustic. He was in the trees and still retreating, 1 step for each of the Alpha's steps. 7th. Then nothing. The Alpha stopped. Graham stopped. She sat in the tent and listened to a silence that lasted about 15 seconds. A held silence, the kind that comes when 2 things have arrived at a new position and are each assessing what it means. She heard Graham breathe. Then she heard the sound she had been listening for all night from Graham Bale, which was the sound of a decision being made. Not the decision he had come to this camp intending to make. A different one. The sound of a plan being set down. She had no specific auditory category for that sound, but she heard it anyway, in the way that you hear the thing beneath the ordinary sounds when you have been paying attention long enough. Graham Bale's flashlight came on. The beam hit the tent entrance directly, and the tent fabric lit up around the zip, and she could see the outline of the zip tab, and the guy lines, and the shadow they made on the green fabric in the directed beam. The light was very steady. It was aimed at the tent entrance, with a deliberateness that matched everything else she had identified in Graham all night. Precise. Intentional, not accidental. 3 seconds. She counted them. The light went out. Then Graham Bale's footsteps moved east, away from the camp, into the forest, and they kept moving, steady and at working pace, and they diminished, over the course of about 2 minutes into the distance, and the forest absorbed them, and the clearing had no humans in it anymore. She exhaled. She became aware of specific things she had been holding for a long time: the tension in her jaw, the tension across her shoulders, the way her hands had been pressing flat on her thighs with a force she had not consciously applied. She let these things go carefully, in order, testing each one as she released it. She was not certain the situation was resolved. She was certain that the 3 men were gone from the immediate area of the camp. She was certain that the Alpha was still in the clearing, and the 7 wolves were still at the northern tree line, and she was still in the tent, and Kota was still on the sleeping bag. The Alpha moved. His footsteps moved east, along the south side of the camp, then south, then west, then north. A slow, deliberate circuit of the tent, close enough to the walls that she could hear his breathing clearly as he passed each side, and on the south side, closest to her, she thought she heard something specific in the quality of that breathing, a note in it that was different from the quality in the clearing. She did not try to name it. He completed the circuit and stopped. He stopped on the north side of the tent. She heard him settle, not lie down but take a settled position, the specific shift of weight that means this is where I am choosing to be, and the sound of that settling had a permanence to it that she found, for reasons she did not examine closely, very steadying. He was on the north side of the tent, between the tent and the direction the 3 men had gone. From the northern tree line she heard the pack adjust. Small sounds, individual animals shifting, spreading along the perimeter, the sounds of 11 bodies taking positions at intervals around the camp, not leaving, distributing. She had read about this, she had never expected to hear it at this range. She turned the battery lamp off. She lay down on the sleeping bag beside Kota and closed her eyes. She did not sleep for a long time. She lay in the dark and listened to the night outside the tent restore itself, the small sounds coming back one at a time, the insects and the branch movements, and the 10,000 minor signs of a forest that has processed what has just happened and is continuing. Underneath all of them, from the north side of the tent, steady and slow and present as anything she had ever tracked in 4 years of field work, the Alpha breathed. She tracked the breathing in the dark with her eyes closed and let it be what it was, which was the sound of the thing that had been in this territory since before she came, and would be in it long after she left. And she held that thought, and the night moved, and the cold deepened, and then at some point she did not precisely track it began to ease, and somewhere in that easing she fell asleep. At 4:47, her eyes opened. The lamp had shifted from amber to pale gray in the long hours. She lay still for a moment and assessed the quality of the dark outside the tent. It was not the same dark as midnight. It had a different density to it, a thinner quality, and she had slept in enough wild places at enough latitudes to know what that difference meant with precision. Dawn was coming. Kota lifted his head. He had been lying beside her, and she had not tracked when he moved from sitting to lying, or how long ago that transition had happened. He was there, and now his head came up slowly, and his nose went north, and she heard it. It came through the canvas from the north side of the tent, so low that hearing it required a decision rather than just a reception. She had to choose to hear it. She chose. A single, brief, very low sound, entirely directed inward, entirely private, intended for the inside of this tent and nothing beyond it. Kota answered. His answer was also low and also brief, and the 2 sounds were different in pitch and in depth, but they fitted together in a way that made her understand something about fit that she had not understood as well before this. The call and the answer, the question and the confirmation, the adult and the young one. She lay on the sleeping bag, in the gray pre-dawn of the tent, and listened to this happen, 12 inches from her ear, and then she lay there a moment longer. Then she reached for the zip. The clearing held its silence in the way that clearings hold things, which is completely and without comment. She lay on the sleeping bag with her eyes closed and tracked the night by sound. The Alpha on the north side of the tent was breathing. The pack at the perimeter was breathing. The forest beyond the perimeter had its own breathing, the aggregate of 10,000 small lives going about their small lives, insects and rodents and the birds that do not sleep in the way large animals sleep. She had fallen into the habit, over 4 years in the field, of hearing all of this as a single sound, rather than as individual components, and the single sound had a quality tonight that she did not have a category for. It was not threatening. It was not comforting in any conventional sense. It was present in the specific way that things are present when they are simply what they are, without modification or performance, and being near that kind of presence was the closest thing to rest she had found in all her years in wild places. She lay still and let it be. She thought, once, about Claire. She thought about the address she had written in the margin of the notebook and the 2 phone numbers, and what Claire would have said if she could have seen the inside of this tent at 2 in the morning. She thought about Claire would have said something specific and practical in the way Claire always said things, and then she thought about something else, and Claire's voice in her head said something she did not entirely hear, and that was fine. She thought about the snare. She thought about it the way you return to a problem that you have set down, and that is still running underneath the other things, working on itself. The snare had been in the ravine for weeks. The pack had been using the ravine during that time. She had data from day 9 of a large male moving south on the ravine trail at 11:40 at night, consistent with alpha movement. If the alpha had been using the ravine trail, he had passed near the snare. If he had passed near the snare, he had known it was there, because wolves map their territory in a way that includes the kind of foreign object information that a wire snare would register as foreign. She thought about the alpha knowing the snare was there, and what that meant. She set it aside. It was a question for later, when she had the data and the distance to think about it properly. At 2:14 she heard something she had not heard all night. It was brief and faint, and it came from the direction of the western tree line, north of where Carl's last position had been. She listened for it again. It did not come again. She filed it as inconclusive. At 2:47, Roy Sims's voice came once more from the east. This time she got more of it than she had gotten at earlier points in the night, because the wind had died again, and the clearing was very still. She got 4 words out of 6 or 7, enough to understand the structure of what he was saying, which was a question about time. Graham's response was 2 words. She did not catch either of them. She thought about Roy asking about time. She thought about what it meant that Roy was asking about time at 2:47, when the original expectation from the circling and the positions had suggested a shorter engagement. She thought about the satellite window in 36 minutes, and she wondered if Roy had his own sense of the satellite schedule. She set that aside too. The alpha on the north side of the tent had not moved since settling into his position at approximately 1:15. She had been tracking his breathing for over an hour, and it had not changed. The rhythm was absolutely steady. The depth was absolutely steady. She had documentation of resting adults at various ages from her 4 years of research, metabolic data, and heart rate data, and respiratory data from the literature, and from the indirect measures she could make in the field. And the steady rhythm of the breathing she was hearing from the north side of the tent was consistent with complete physical ease. He had settled in for the night the way you settle in when you have made a decision, and the decision is simple. At 3:50 she heard Carl Eaton on the western tree line. She was almost certain of it. A foot on frozen ground at a specific position, brief, and then silence. But Carl was supposed to be gone. She had heard Carl leave at around 12:45, moving west. If Carl was on the western tree line at 3:50, he had either not gone far or had come back, and neither of those options was one she wanted to examine in detail right now. She focused on the satellite window in 19 minutes. At 4:11, the window opened. She reached for the satellite communicator in the dark, navigated by touch to the transmission function, and sent the position fix and the pre-composed emergency message she had been composing in her head for the last 2 hours. Her coordinates, the nature of the situation, the number of individuals, the request for a response via secondary radio channel in the morning. 3 minutes and 40 seconds. She set the communicator down and lay back. The alpha breathed on the north side of the tent. The sky outside was still dark, but the dark was different now. She lay in the sleeping bag with her hand on Coda's side, and she felt the long, slow shift of the night toward morning, the way the dark gets thin at its edges before any light appears, the way the birds begin to become aware of what is coming before any other sign of it arrives. She had seen this moment in 100 places, and this one was no different, and also completely different from all of them. She lay still. At 4:37, a bird called from the eastern tree line, a single, tentative, questioning call, the sound a bird makes when it is not sure yet whether it is morning, but is beginning to think it might be. Then nothing. Then, at 4:41, a second call, from further north, more confident. The sky was changing. She pressed her hand against Coda's side, and felt his heartbeat, still slow, still deep. Different from the heartbeat she had felt in the ravine, the fast, light heartbeat of an animal under stress. This was the heartbeat of an animal that had completed something and was resting in the completion of it. At 4:47, Kota lifted his head. She opened the zip. The cold came through the gap before the zip had moved 3 centimeters, the clean, total cold of high-altitude early morning that a person from a city would describe as shocking, and that she had come to know as simply the first thing, the condition that precedes everything else at this hour in this place. She pulled the zip all the way down, pushed the tent flap aside, and stepped out onto the frozen ground and straightened up. The light was the light that exists in the brief time before the sun actually arrives, flat and gray, without shadows, the light that makes everything equidistant and equally valued, that treats the near and the far as the same distance, and the large and the small as the same scale. She had seen this light in the field more times than she could count, from Iceland to Spain, from mountain camps and coastal research sites, and the edges of forests in half a dozen countries. It always looked the same, and it always did the same thing to her, which was make the world look like something that was still considering itself. The Alpha was standing 6 meters in front of her. She had known, from the sound through the canvas and the ground vibration, and 11 days of data, what he would look like at this distance. She understood now that she had been wrong. Not about the scar. The scar was exactly where she had placed it, through the long lens, on the left side of his face, running from below the amber eye to the corner of the jaw, pale against the darker fur around it. Not about the stripe along his back, which ran exactly as the camera trap frames had suggested, dark charcoal at the spine fading to the pale silver gray of the sides and legs. Not about any specific physical feature she had measured or estimated. She had been wrong about the thing that documentation cannot capture, which is the way an animal of a certain size and a certain age occupies the space around it. He was not just large in the dimension she had calculated, height at the shoulder, estimated body length, inferred mass from track depth and territory data. He was large in the way that certain living things are large in kind, rather than just in degree, the kind of size that changes the character of the space it is in. He was looking at her. His amber eyes were on her face. She met them directly, and did not look away, because she was not a threat to what stood in front of her, and she had nothing to hide from what stood in front of her, and looking away from it right now would have felt dishonest, in a way she could not have explained to anyone who had not spent enough time with wolves to know what honesty looks like in this context. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned to the tent and reached inside carefully, and lifted Kota, her hands supporting his chest and hindquarters, and she straightened up with him, and walked forward 2 steps, and crouched down, and set him on the frozen ground. His injured paw touched the surface first. He tested it, slowly, distributing weight gradually. The healing had been good in the hours since the dressing, and the paw took the weight with only a slight hesitation. Then his 3 sound legs took the rest, and he was standing on the frozen ground of the camp clearing in the gray morning light, and his nose was already working before she had fully released him. She stood back. She stood at the tent entrance and watched Kota's nose work, and she saw the moment the chemistry arrived, because his whole body responded to it, the way a compass responds to north, the way a river responds to gravity. Some things go in one direction because they cannot go in any other, and what she was watching was one of those things. He began to walk. 3 legs, the injured one carried slightly off the ground, his head held lower than usual, the posture of a young wolf approaching an adult with appropriate deference. The approach was not tentative. He knew exactly where he was going, and what it would be like when he got there. He was simply observing the conventions of the approach, the things that tell the adult that the young one understands the order of things, and the Alpha held still, while Kota crossed the ground between them. 10 steps. Kota stopped with his nose against the Alpha's chest. The Alpha lowered his head. He brought it all the way down, the full distance from his normal head height to the level where Kota stood, and the size of the movement made the degree of the lowering obvious and significant. He held his head there, steady. Kota raised his nose and pressed it against the Alpha's face, against the scar on the left side of his jaw, and the Alpha was perfectly still and let this happen. She watched. She did not write in her notebook. She did not reach for her camera. She watched. The greeting lasted about 40 seconds and involved the full range of contact behaviors She had spent 4 years learning to identify and record. The nose contact, the facial investigation, the body press, the small vocalizations from Coda that were not quite calls and not quite whimpers, but something specific to this kind of reunion. She had documented greeting sequences in other packs, from observation distances that required the long lens, and she had documented them well. She knew what she was watching. She also knew that what she was watching was something she would never fully document. Some things resist documentation. Not because they are mysterious or unknowable, but because they are primarily experiences rather than events, and experience does not transfer fully into notation, no matter how careful the notation is. She had known this about her work for a long time. She had spent 4 years getting as close to the thing as notation could get. At the end of the greeting sequence between a 10-week-old cub and the alpha of his pack, in the gray light of a mountain morning, after a night that she would spend a long time assembling into language, she sat down on the frozen ground because her legs made a decision without consulting her. She sat in the snow of the camp clearing. Coda pressed himself against the alpha's front leg. The alpha put his head down one more time, and then straightened to his full height. He looked at her, directly. The full amber attention that she had felt all night through the tent wall and the canvas and the ground was now directed at her, across 6 meters of open frozen ground, in a light that was improving by the minute, and she looked back at it, and felt something she did not immediately try to name. 3 seconds, maybe 4. Then he turned north. The pack came out of the trees. They did not rush. They came out of the northern tree line one by one, in the unhurried and continuous way of animals that are not performing movement but simply moving, each one emerging from the pines and crossing into the clearing and moving toward Coda. She counted them as they came. 7 she had been tracking all night, then 2 more she had not confirmed, then a third, and finally an 11th moving at the back, who she placed as the large adult female she had associated with the highest set of eyes at the tree line. 11. She had 11. She had always had 11. They moved around Coda the way water moves around the thing it is seeking, without hesitation, with complete accommodation of everything that he was, enveloping him in movement and warmth and the specific chemistry of a pack that has been a pack for longer than any of its members has been alive. Coda stood in the middle of them, and his head moved from one to another with a quickness that was not frantic, but simply alive, the quick, eager attention of a young animal, returning to the only frame of reference that makes complete sense to it. Then the alpha moved north, and the pack moved north, and Coda moved north with them, his 3-legged gait at the back of the group keeping the pace of the adults around him. And they went into the northern tree line, and the pines folded around them, and the clearing was empty. She sat in the snow where she was. She sat for a while that she could not have accurately measured, and she looked at the northern tree line, and at the frozen ground where the paw prints were already beginning to look older than they were, and at the sky, which was shifting from flat gray to the pale gold that comes just before actual sunrise, and that always managed to arrive before she had finished preparing for it. She picked up her notebook from where she had set it on the snow beside her. She opened it and began to write. She wrote for 2 hours without stopping. She wrote the full account of everything that had happened, from the moment she heard the sound from the ravine to the moment the last wolf went into the northern tree line. She wrote it the way she wrote everything, in clear and specific language, with times and positions and sensory details. She wrote about the boot prints and the 3 positions, and the voice on the north side, and Coda's call through the canvas roof. She wrote about the 7 pairs of amber eyes, and the vibration of the alpha's approach, and the 7-step exchange in the clearing, and Carl Eaton's 3 words, and Graham Bale's flashlight held for exactly 3 seconds on the tent entrance. She wrote about a 10-week-old cub walking on 3 legs toward the largest wolf she had ever seen in the field, and pressing his nose against a scar that she had been identifying from 400 meters for 11 days. She wrote about the alpha looking at her. At 9:30, her field radio came alive on the secondary channel. Owen Hart's voice had a quality she had not heard in either of their 2 previous conversations, a tension that his normally level delivery was not quite containing. He was on his 3rd call-up and increasing in urgency by the time she got the radio to her face. She said, "I am here." She gave him the account in compressed field form, the version that could travel over a radio channel and be written down at the other end in real time. She gave him times and positions and grid references and the specific detail about the wire snare in the ravine. She told him about the audio recorder and that she would give him access to it. She gave him a physical description of the 3 men she had been able to partially construct from sounds and boot prints, and the one partial voice she had clearly identified. Owen Hart asked her one question. He asked if she was all right. She said yes. Graham Bale was found 11 days later by a joint investigation team working from the audio recording and the boot print analysis, and several other lines of evidence she had provided in the 5 formal statements she gave in the days after. He was 300 kilometers south, and he had made no particular attempt to disappear, which told her something about his assessment of his situation. He had not believed the evidence would come together. The investigation that followed ran for 7 months. It uncovered a network that had been operating for 6 years. The scope of it, when it was finally mapped, covered a range that connected at one end to a forest in Norway, where a snare had been found near a trail marker 4 years earlier, and at the other end to buyers in 3 countries who paid prices that reflected the particular scarcity of certain living things. Buyers in 3 countries. She thought about the flask cap in the ravine. She thought about 40 more snares in a 3-kilometer stretch of trail in Norway. She thought about all the things she had filed and the reports she had made and the data she had gathered, and the way it had all moved through the proper channels and come out the other side as statistics. She testified 8 months after the night in the tent. She drove to the courthouse on a cold Tuesday morning and sat in a chair and answered questions for 3 hours. She answered them carefully and completely, and with the same discipline she brought to field documentation. When a lawyer tried 3 different times to get her to describe the Alpha as dangerous, she said she had not found him dangerous. She said she had found him consistent. She said she had found him exactly what 11 days of data and 1 night of direct proximity had suggested he would be, which was a large adult male wolf in his own territory, responding to a specific situation with a specificity and a competence that matched the research literature on territorial behavior in mature pack leaders. The lawyer moved on. She returned to the mountain the following spring with a new field window, 3 weeks, a wider brief, and permission to deploy additional camera traps in positions she had not been able to cover the previous year. She set the camp at a different position, further north, nearer to the ridge, and she spent the first 3 days re-establishing her baseline observations and recalibrating her expectations for what the data would look like in a second season. On the 9th day she heard 2 voices on the North Ridge. One was the deep, certain voice of the Alpha, immediately recognizable to her now in the way that voices are recognizable once you have spent the night listening to them through canvas at close range. The other was lighter, higher, not yet at the full resonant depth of an adult, the voice of a young wolf in the juvenile stage, past the cub vocalization range but not yet at the adult range. She sat down on the rock shelf where she was working with the long lens already in her hand, and she raised it to the North Ridge and looked through it. She could not see them. The ridge was dense with pines, and the morning light was still low, and the angle was not right. She sat and listened. The 2 voices moved along the ridge together, the adult and the young one, in no hurry, neither of them waiting for the other, or adjusting pace for the other, but both moving at the same pace, because they had arrived at the same pace through long practice. The pace of 2 animals who know the same terrain and have walked it together enough times that their movement through it has become a shared thing. She held the long lens up for another minute. The pines showed her nothing. She lowered the lens and opened her notebook to the last entry from the previous year, the one she had made on the morning after, sitting in the snow in front of the tent with the pack prints fresh in the frozen ground around her. She found the margin, where she kept the informal notes, and she turned past the field entries to the last page of that section. She uncapped her pen. She held it for a moment. Then she wrote, in the margin, in the careful small handwriting she used when she was being precise about something, "He made it." She capped the pen and set the notebook in her lap, and looked at the North Ridge. The 2 voices were still moving along it in the morning air, the adult and the one who was nearly an adult, moving together through the trees in the unhurried and specific way of 2 animals who know exactly where they are, and exactly where they are going, and have no reason to go there any faster than this. She sat on the rock shelf and listened until the voices moved too far north to reach her anymore, and then she sat a little longer in the silence they left, which was not empty, and then she opened her notebook to a fresh page and wrote the date and the time and the grid reference. The work continued. The way work continues. which is by beginning again.